Marvel's master of multiversal magic. Hello again, dear adventurers of the multiverse. Thanks for joining us once more on this epic journey. Remember, this story is pure science fiction from our wild imagination, so don't go trying to summon dragons in your backyard. The rights of this amazing novel belong entirely to its original author. We are only the narrators. Do you want more adventures? Show some love to our YouTube channel with a subscription and a like, and if you want exclusive content, our Patreon is waiting for you with open arms. Chapter 726 Oldner's Abnormality. There was another point George learned from the clown killer. The high sequence of the thief possesses parasitic abilities, while the high sequence of the fate pathway possesses reincarnation abilities, both of which could explain his current situation. Although he was neither a thief nor a fate pathway, but rather a diviner's pathway, it didn't matter. It could also be explained as accidentally consuming the magician's characteristics and surviving by sheer luck. In fact, he felt he didn't need to explain at all. He could let the church fill in the blanks themselves. They would always come up with a suitable reason. As long as his existence benefited the church, as long as he didn't cause trouble or spread the belief in evil gods, the church wouldn't investigate further. Mr. George, may I ask you a question? Old Neil, a member of the Night Watch who hadn't spoken until now, asked hopefully, do you think it's possible for a person who has already died to be resurrected? This Mr. George was probably the highest sequence powerhouse he had ever seen. George's incredible ability to restore a person who had lost control to normal meant that some things weren't impossible. Lately, he had often heard whispers in his ear, telling him how to resurrect his beloved fiancée from his youth. Perhaps, he really could do it. Old Neil, what are you talking about? Before George could reply, Swain's face was already serious. The idea of resurrecting the dead only appeared when cultists tricked ordinary people into believing in evil gods, and the ending was always tragic. It was dangerous for anyone to have such thoughts, and even more dangerous for an extraordinary person. I was just curious. Don't forget to reimburse me for the materials for those 2 sleeping charms. Realizing this wasn't the best time to ask, old Neil quickly changed the subject with a smile. Swain didn't think much of it and replied irritably, don't worry, I'll reimburse you double. It's best not to believe in resurrection, George casually added. For him, resurrection wasn't impossible, and there were multiple methods. But the prerequisite was that the soul was still alive and hadn't reincarnated. However, he generally wouldn't do that, especially in a world he didn't understand well. He didn't know where the souls of the dead went in this world, and if summoning a soul disturbed the god of death, it could cause considerable trouble. Unless there's something that can sway him and offer him a benefit worth a risk. And old Neil, a Sequence 9 Night Watcher, clearly has nothing that can sway him. Besides, in this world where many evil gods are watching, performing a resurrection ritual is indeed an extremely dangerous thing. There's always a way. Old Neil seemed a little dazed upon hearing this, having already made up his mind. Is this guy mentally unstable? George glanced at old Neil, raising an eyebrow. Just now, he sensed that old Neil's soul seemed to have an abnormality. It's either a physical problem or a mental problem. The extraordinary beings in this world are really miserable. I wonder if those 7 true gods have similar problems. Just as he was pondering, the door to the room was pushed open. 2 middle-aged men in trench coats walked in. One of them was the Night Watcher captain he had seen before, and the other was someone he hadn't seen before, but could guess that he was probably the current captain of the Punishers. Behind the 2 captains were 2 young men. One was the Night Watcher's diviner Klein, and the other was a sailor sent by Swain. When the 4 entered the room and saw George sitting on the sofa drinking red wine, they were all stunned. They, too, didn't know George was an infant and naturally assumed he was short. However, after a similar internal struggle as Swain, they quickly recovered and greeted him together. Dunn Smith, captain of the Night Watch squad, Jane Evan, captain of the Punisher squad. George put down his wine glass and stood on the sofa to formally introduce himself. George Barton, Sequence 7 magician, an unorganized rogue extraordinary individual, a Sequence 7 magician. Hearing George's answer, everyone's faces showed suspicion. They had always thought George was a high sequence powerhouse, at least Sequence 5, but they hadn't expected him to only be Sequence 7. How could a mere Sequence 7 restore a runaway to normal? They suspected George was lying. Sequence 7 magicians have an ability called damage transfer. I've modified this ability to directly transfer the characteristics of an extraordinary being from their body, which is how I can restore someone who has lost control, George explained. He wasn't lying, According to the extraordinary levels of this world, he was a Sequence 7 magician. However, his actual combat strength was no less than that of Sequence 1 or 2 magicians. If you were to unleash his full power, he could easily defeat a Sequence 0 true god. Dunn and Jane exchanged a glance, clearly not entirely convinced by George's explanation, but they didn't question him. Instead, they chatted with George amicably. Their purpose in coming here wasn't to capture George, but to make initial contact with this high-sequence powerhouse and gather information about him. This way, they could report the situation in detail to headquarters, where the higher-ups would decide how to handle the matter concerning George. Thank you for your help to the Punisher. If you need anything in Tingen, you can contact me directly through Swain. Your residence is within the protection zone of our Night Watchers. You can also find me at Blackthorn Security Company, 2nd floor, 36 Zotlin Street. After some polite conversation and learning George's current address from Swain, the two captains left the Dragon Bar. They would immediately verify some information about George and report it to headquarters, awaiting instructions. The trading market is inside, right? It's my first time here, I'll go in and have a look. After the two captains left, George put on his cloak hood and black scarf, intending to stroll around the extraordinary market of this world. Although the list didn't contain the materials he needed, he had no reason to go back now, and since he was already here, he might as well browse. Mr. George, if you see anything you like, just take it. The owner can bring this to me to settle the bill later. Swain handed George a plaque engraved with a dragon symbol. George didn't stand on ceremony and nodded to accept it. At this moment, Klein, who had originally planned to shop at the extraordinary market, suddenly had an idea and invited George. Mr. George, this is my first time here too. How about we go together? No problem. George smiled and didn't refuse. It seems you haven't been in extraordinary for very long. Chapter 727 In the Name of the Moon, I Will Punish You. George was very interested in the powerful special space within Klein. After becoming a magician, he felt that his own extraordinary magician traits seemed to have a subtle connection with the power in Klein's space. Yes, I was just an ordinary person before. I joined the Night Watchers because I got involved in an extraordinary event, and I've only been a diviner for a few months. Klein didn't hide his experiences over the past few months and told the truth. To build a relationship with someone, you need to let that person know you so that you can establish trust. George was in the same sequence as him, and if he could get along well, he might be able to trade with George for information about the next steps in his sequence. Most Night Watchers of the Church of the Goddess of the Night choose the Dark Path, and all the potion recipes and advancement paths from Sequence 9 to Sequence 0 are very clear. But the Church of the Goddess of the Night doesn't only have the Dark Path, there are also some lower sequence potion recipes for other paths. In other words, Night Watchers can also choose other paths instead of the Dark Path. It's just that later advancements will have to be figured out by themselves. The Church doesn't encourage choosing other paths, but it doesn't forbid them either, because most Night Watchers will spend their entire lives hovering in the lower sequences. Furthermore, in battles between lower sequences, cooperation between different sequences is naturally much more comprehensive than cooperation between single sequences. For example, he's a Sequence 9 diviner, able to divine danger before an action and find clues to various events through divination. Old Neil is a Sequence 9 seer. Seers have a comprehensive but rudimentary understanding and mastery of mystical knowledge such as magic, witchcraft, and astrology, and know a considerable amount of ritual magic. For example, how to open spiritual vision, how to perform ritual magic, and Hemira, ancient Hemira, Elvish, Dragonite, and Giant languages. This greatly enhances their learning ability. Their unique ability, the Seer's Eye, allows them to see more than most other Beyonders of the same sequence. And then there's Daily Simone, who is responsible for checking them before. She's a Death Path cultivator, skilled at dealing with corpses. The combined power of an unsleeper, a corpse collector, a seer, and a diviner will certainly be much stronger than 4 unsleepers. The reason he didn't choose the complete Dark Path was because he discovered some secrets in the notes left by the former transmigrator, Emperor Roselle, in simplified Chinese. The diviner's path might help him return to his own world in the future. It was also because of Emperor Roselle's notes that he learned about the role-playing method and was almost finished digesting the potion in his body. However, he still didn't know what the next stage of the diviner's path was called, or what the potion recipe was. The two walked and talked, passing through several rooms, and arrived at an open-air market about the size of a basketball court. The market was crowded with vendors and all sorts of buyers. 90% of them were occult enthusiasts, and very few were truly extraordinary. For many occult enthusiasts, this open-air market was their trading ground. However, some of the things they traded were indeed related to occultism. For example, moonflower, citronella, night-blooming jasmine, sterling silver, citron, and rubies were all basic materials that could be used for rituals and making talismans. However, finished amulets, exorcism charms, and lucky charms were not very useful. Some materials only had a slight effect because they possessed a rudimentary spiritual quality. After browsing around, George didn't buy anything. The materials here were too low-grade and useless to him. Even if he made talismans, they would only be the lowest grade, with no research value. Besides, he had only interrogated the clown killer, not searched his soul, so he didn't know everything and couldn't create talismans for this world. How much? Klein was clearly interested in the materials in the market and quickly started haggling with the stall owner. However, he was clearly not wealthy. Looks like an unexpected acquisition. I wonder if he understands the value of his own space. George stroked his chin, watching Klein haggle, secretly analyzing the situation. After spending some time with him, he was certain that Klein wasn't some powerful being possessed or reincarnated, he was just an ordinary young man of his age. Therefore, the god-level spatial item that Klein possessed, comparable to his own world and possessing immense power, definitely wasn't something he created himself. It was most likely an unexpected acquisition or a gift from a god-level or higher powerhouse in this world. What he wasn't sure about now was whether Klein knew the value of his item and whether he could use its power. 8 Sul, that's the lowest I can go. I'm the only one selling this here. If you don't want it, then forget it. Finally, after Klein's persistent pleading, the stall owner lowered the price from 10 Sul to 8. Klein thought for a moment, then finally took out 8 Sul and bought a material he needed. However, he couldn't help but mutter under his breath, in a voice only he could hear, "I really want to destroy you in the name of the moon." George, who heard this, was stunned. His hearing was too good, even in the noisy market, Klein's soft voice couldn't escape his ears. His surprise stemmed from the fact that this phrase was the battle cry of a certain beautiful girl from his previous life. He also thought of the Emperor Roselle recorded in history books. He began to suspect that Klein, like Roselle, was either thrown into this world by some powerful being or deliberately created by the creator of this world. This could also explain why Klein, whose strength was only at sequence 9, could possess an item on par with a god. That was clearly Klein's cheat code. However, it's also possible that it was something Roselle had said, which Klein simply quoted. That Emperor Roselle left behind quite a few melodramatic declarations and sayings in this world. Alternatively, it could be a coincidence. After all, in the creation myth of this world, the goddess of night was formed from one of the eyes of the primordial creator. And that eye of the primordial creator just happened to become the moon. So, as a follower of the goddess of night and a night watchman, it seems somewhat reasonable for Klein to utter a phrase like "in the name of the moon, I will punish you." We'll find out by testing him. Watching Klein get up after buying his things, George's lips curled into a smile. "Klein, what is it, Mr. George?" Klein turned to look at George with some confusion. George smiled slightly. "You're a transmigrator, aren't you? No need for beating around the bush, just that direct. If you are listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means it was downloaded and re-uploaded without effort. We warmly invite you to visit our channel, Fanfic World. There you will find the original version of this story and many other novels of various genres. We look forward to seeing you dive into a world of incredible novels. Chapter 728: The True and False Transmigrators. Upon hearing George's sudden question, Klein's pupils contracted sharply, and his expression nearly faltered. His mind was in turmoil. Being exposed as a transmigrator so abruptly caught him completely off guard. Why did George know he was a transmigrator? Why did George know the term transmigrator? What exactly was George's identity? Was he also a transmigrator? Or was his transmigration related to his own? A barrage of questions exploded in his mind, causing him to pause for a long while before he could react, feigning confusion as he replied, "Mr. George, what did you say? What transmigrator? Is it some kind of special sequence?" He was cautious before clarifying George's identity, not daring to risk revealing it. The other party might just be testing him, He couldn't be tricked into revealing himself so easily. If it were when he first transmigrated, he might not have had this composure. But after these past few months, becoming an extraordinary diviner had brought him significant growth in all aspects. So you really are. Don't worry, I am too. Come on, let's go outside and talk. George turned and walked directly outside. Klein managed to control his expression well, but George's keen observation saw through his disguise at a glance. Fortunately, George also revealed his identity as a transmigrator to reassure Klein. If Klein was like him, thrown into this world by some powerful being, then he would definitely want to get to know him. It was rare to find someone similar to himself. Perhaps he could learn more about Hongjin and other powerful beings from Klein. If Klein was created by the creator of this world, then he would also want to get to know him and see if he could learn anything about the creator through Klein. Or perhaps he could use Klein to test the creator of this world. He really is a transmigrator too. Klein's expression changed after hearing George's words, then he gritted his teeth and followed. Although he had been in this world for several months and had family and friends, this wasn't his home, and he still wanted to go back. If the other person was indeed a transmigrator, then he might be able to find a way back through him. Of course, it was also possible that the other person wasn't telling the truth, but at this moment, he was willing to take the risk. Leaving the Dragon Bar, it was completely dark outside. George led Klein to the riverbank at the dock and asked, "When did you travel to this world?" "June 28th, less than 3 months ago," Klein countered. "And you?" "A few months earlier than you." George continued to probe for information. "From China, do you want to go back?" Klein nodded, then, as if realizing something, said, "I don't know if you want to go back, but I do. I miss my family and friends, and I don't want to stay in this world forever, even if it possesses extraordinary powers. So I think we don't need to test each other anymore. I'm willing to tell you the details of my journey and my situation, and I hope you can be honest with me. That way, we can find a way back." He desperately wanted to return to his world as soon as possible, and George was much stronger than him. If he didn't show honesty, he wouldn't gain George's trust. This wouldn't be good for either of them. "I want to go back too." "What you said makes sense. Let me tell you my situation first." Sensing the sincerity in Klein's tone, George's heart stirred, and he began to fabricate a story. "Before I transmigrated, I was a Taoist priest. After transmigrating, I discovered that my body was exceptionally strong. That must be my transmigration cheat." He pressed a finger against a nearby stone, making a hole as easily as pressing tofu. Klein's eyebrows rose in disbelief. "Later, I often went out at night to gather information about this world. I happened to witness your battle at the warehouse, so I secretly stopped the guy wearing the clown mask. Through interrogation, I obtained information about the extraordinary, killed him, and absorbed his extraordinary ability, thus becoming a Sequence 7 magician. After becoming Sequence 7, I began to study the abilities of magicians and the spiritual abilities within their bodies. Because of my experience as a Taoist priest in my previous life, I have a lot of cultivation knowledge that was useless in my previous life. It is precisely because of this knowledge that I was able to successfully improve the current abilities of magicians, and restoring the out-of-control individuals is one of the improved abilities, 9 parts truth and 1 part falsehood. Apart from the cheat ability and the Taoist priest identity being fabricated, everything else is basically true. He is indeed a transmigrator, but he transmigrated to Marvel, and this is just an avatar. Since he can be considered a Taoist priest, the identity of the Lee family patriarch is a Taoist priest, and another avatar is about to join the G sect, so he is definitely a Taoist priest as well. So that one part of the lie is not entirely false. Seeing that George was so frank and proactive, even revealing his biggest trump card, the cheat ability, Klein completely stopped holding back. "My name is Joe Mingru. Before I transmigrated, I was an office worker. That day, something's not right." While carefully analyzing Klein's account of his experiences, George noticed something suspicious. The country Klein lived in before his transmigration was actually the same as before, but he had never heard of the city he lived in, and the country's leaders were different. What did this mean? It meant that even if Klein transmigrated, he didn't come from his previous world. Furthermore, Klein's transmigration was due to a fortune-changing ritual, and after arriving in this world, it was also because of this ritual that he gained a cheat ability, entering a special gray fog space. He had never heard of the object of that ritual, the heavenly venerable Fusheng Zhuangherwang. Since you can pull people into your gray fog space, I'll try your ritual later and see if you can pull me in. After thinking for a moment, George had an idea. To uncover the secret of Klein's transmigration, he had to start by investigating his gray fog space. He couldn't use his full strength to forcefully open the gray fog space and squeeze in, so he wanted to try the ritual and have Klein pull him in. Alright, wait for me to go in first. Klein nodded, then immediately took 4 steps backward, chanting an incantation, his soul leaving his body and entering his own gray mist space. Seeing this, George also followed Klein's example, taking 4 steps backward and chanting the same incantation. May the immortal venerable of Xuanhuang be blessed. May the heavenly lord of Xuanhuang be blessed. May the supreme god of Xuanhuang be blessed. May the heavenly venerable of Xuanhuang be blessed. Immediately afterward, he felt a force emanating from Klein's gray mist space, trying to pull his soul into it. It was within the gray mist space that Klein sensed the stars illuminating George due to the ritual, reaching out to touch them, pulling him into the gray mist space as he had done before. Chapter 729 The Desperate Truth of Transmigration. Let's go in and take a look. George didn't resist the power of the gray mist, allowing it to pull his soul smoothly into the gray mist space. With his soul strength, if he didn't want to go in, the gray mist wouldn't have been able to pull him in at all. You're George. Klein's face showed surprise when he saw the young man who appeared in front of him. He thought that George, who was pulled into the gray mist space, would be in the form of an infant, but he didn't expect him to be a young man. But then he thought about it, and it made sense. George was a transmigrator like him, but he occupied the body of an infant, and his soul was naturally still the soul of his previous life. This also indirectly proved that what George said was true. Yes, this is the inner space of the gray mist. George looked around. He was now in a huge palace. High above the palace was a throne, and below it was a long bronze table with 10 seats on each side. When I first came in, this place was all gray mist. This scene is a manifestation of my imagination, Klein explained. However, I can only stay in this palace I created, and I can't enter the space above the palace. Perhaps I need greater strength to break through the gray fog and explore. I'll give it a try. George looked up through the palace at the top of the gray fog, and could vaguely see the stairs leading to the core hidden in the gray fog. He directly flew up with Klein. He couldn't force his way in from the outside, but now that he was inside, he could try, given his soul strength. Open it. George plunged his hands into the gray fog and forcefully pulled to both sides. Relying on his soul, which was even stronger than a true god, he actually managed to force a path through the gray fog. Then, he and Klein squeezed upward step by step. 1 step, 2 steps, 3 steps, 4 steps, 5 steps. When the two reached the 6th step, just when they were about to break through the gray fog completely, they were blocked. After several attempts, George realized that without using other powers, he couldn't squeeze through this last layer by force with his soul alone. Is it not possible? Klein, who had been following behind with hope, suddenly looked tense when he saw George stop at the last step. This gray fog might hold the secret to their transmigration. If they could get in, they might find a way home. At the same time, he was amazed by George's strength. Both were transmigrators, and neither had been in this world for long, so why was George so much stronger? Was it because he was an ordinary person before his transmigration, while George was a Taoist priest, possessing some extraordinary knowledge of their own world? It's not a big problem. George released his grip, showing no sign of difficulty. He still had his ultimate technique, the soul stacking technique, that multiplied his soul strength. With his current soul strength, it wasn't enough to break through this last layer of gray fog, but adding the soul of one more clone would be enough. He didn't even need to add the souls of all his clones. Open, by temporarily drawing the soul power of one clone into the soul of this world, George's soul strength instantly doubled. With a single slash of his hand, he cleaved through the last layer of gray mist, revealing a mysterious space behind it. Before their eyes was a brilliant portal tinged with a bluish-black hue, and hanging from the portal were thin black lines. These lines connected to one after another nearly transparent cocoons. Inside each cocoon were human souls, some dark-skinned, some Asian, and some Caucasian. These souls wore modern clothing, holding cell phones, bags, game consoles, and bank cards, all fast asleep, their duration unknown. The 3 cocoons closest to the portal had already broken open, revealing their emptiness. How could this be? Klein stared at the scene before him, completely stunned. his mind racing with thoughts and speculations, his expression utterly out of control. George narrowed his eyes, recalling the history he had witnessed recently, and some answers began to form in his mind. He had truly transmigrated. Klein, however, had likely not, but had been trapped in this gray mist space by its true master, only released now. Historical records suggest that a prehistoric civilization may have existed before the First Era. This prehistoric civilization is most likely the modern civilization Klein and his group inhabit. The souls within these cocoons were probably captured from the modern world and stored here. 3 cocoons have already broken open. One contains Klein, another is likely Roselle, and the third is unknown. The true purpose of the owner of this gray mist space remains unclear. Of course, these are only preliminary speculations based on existing information. The truth will only be known after further investigation. If that's the case, this gray mist space cannot be touched for now. Not knowing who the true owner of the gray mist space is or what their purpose is, he fears that rashly acquiring it might attract the true owner's attention. Given the strength displayed by this gray mist space, its true owner is at least a true god. He isn't afraid of being defeated. Even if he can't win, he's confident he can escape. However, doing so would completely expose his strength, attracting the attention of the creator of this world, which would be troublesome. But he won't give up so easily. Based on the level of this gray fog space, absorbing it and integrating it into one's own world would be equivalent to directly swallowing a world like the world of a magic apprentice. It would significantly enhance his strength. Giving up because of this small danger wasn't his style. Moreover, judging from the current situation, he guessed that the true owner of the gray fog space might already be gone, or severely injured, needing to release the modern souls he had captured to remedy the situation. If that were the case, then there was even less to worry about. Could it be, we can't go back? Klein was also a very intelligent guy. He shared the same conjecture as George. However, in his conjecture, the 3 broken cocoons were Roselle, himself, and George, exactly 3. Perhaps things aren't as bad as we think. Seeing Klein's face filled with despair, and even his mental state beginning to deteriorate, George offered a word of comfort. Anything is possible. Even if it's true, there might still be a way back. He wasn't lying to Klein about this. Time is not irreversible. If we can find the creator of this world, perhaps there's a way to send Klein back to the present through the river of time. Or, to make it simpler, we could have him devour and merge with this world, which would also send Klein back. Chapter 730 Codename Power. I hope so. Hearing George's comforting words, Klein felt a little better. However, deep down, he had already given up much hope of returning home. The next step was simply to gather relevant information, further verify his guesses, and then completely lose hope. Fortunately, he had known from the beginning that finding his way home was extremely difficult and almost impossible. So he had always been prepared. Although he was currently filled with despair, he could still bear it. Otherwise, he might have already lost control and become a monster like the sailor he met today. You're such an optimistic person. After a long while, Klein, who had somewhat recovered, looked at George and, finding that George wasn't as desperate as him, couldn't help but sigh. Life may have tormented me 1,000 times, but I treat life like my first love. George smiled and shrugged. Actually, Klein was lucky to have met him. He would give Klein a chance to return home later. Unlike himself, who didn't know how long it would take to find his own world in this vast chaos. Yes, even if life gives me lemons, I'll still squeeze out the juice of a smile. As if infected by George, a fellow transmigrator, Klein immediately felt much better, and his mood eased considerably. Facing challenges alone versus with companions is a completely different psychological burden. Just like walking alone in the dark is terrifying, while walking with someone else in the dark might be filled with laughter and conversation. Ha ha ha, looks like we get along quite well. George patted Klein on the shoulder. It was quite amusing that someone could immediately pick up on a joke he made. The tacit understanding between 2 old people who have been hanging together for who knows how many years. Klein and George left the space above and returned to the main hall, sitting down at the bronze table. What do we do next? Now that you've joined the Church of the Goddess of Night, you should strive to improve your strength and climb the ranks, aiming to enter the church headquarters. As one of the 7 major righteous churches, they should have some information about prehistoric civilizations there. George shared his thoughts. As for me, I'll be traveling outside the major churches, trying to find relevant information through other means. He also needs to understand this world better, especially information about angels and true gods, and ideally, find clues about the original creator. Okay, I'll try my best to get into the core of the church, Klein nodded. He had originally planned to do the same, but after seeing the scene above the gray fog, he knew the hope was slim. But it was better than having no hope at all. He was still somewhat unwilling to give up. You need to be careful. The church isn't actually that friendly to wild beyonders, even if you don't belong to an evil organization. It's only because you might be Sequence 6 or Sequence 5 that the captain is acting so kindly to keep you in check. For the 7 major churches, all beyonders outside the church are unstable factors. So when a church's beyonder organization discovers a wild beyonder, if they belong to an evil god's organization, they are all captured and killed, or used as guinea pigs for sealing experiments. If they don't belong to an organization, they will also be captured and imprisoned if they behave poorly. If someone unexpectedly becomes an extraordinary being and behaves well in all aspects, the first step is to try to recruit them. If that fails, they should be closely monitored to prevent any unforeseen circumstances. The 2 church captains' initial friendliness towards George stemmed from several reasons. First, George acted very kindly, rescuing a member of the church who had gone out of control. Second, George's ability to restore those who had gone out of control to normal was highly valuable and worthy of attention. Third, George generously revealed his identity, along with his parents and home address, further demonstrating goodwill. Fourth, and most importantly, George's strength was considerable, likely far beyond what he claimed to be Sequence 7. He could be Sequence 6, or even Sequence 5. Such a powerful extraordinary being, if provoked, would be uncontrollable in the entire city of Tingen, causing significant destruction. Therefore, their friendliness was partly out of goodwill towards George, and partly to appease him while awaiting instructions from the church leadership. If the church leadership's order was to arrest George, they would not hesitate to act against him. Just now, when Captain Dunn left, he instructed him to keep an eye on George to see if they could obtain further information about him. He invited George to browse the extraordinary market, partly to discuss future potion recipes and partly to complete the captain's mission. He felt George had acted recklessly. If he were George, he wouldn't have exposed himself so early. The church was full of powerful figures. If they were truly determined to imprison George, even with his past life's knowledge of magic and his extraordinary physique, he would be no match. However, if George hadn't exposed himself, he wouldn't have met him and learned the truth so soon. Sometimes, fate is truly unpredictable. I'll be careful, George nodded, not objecting. This was all within his expectations. By the way, your tarot club is quite interesting. Invite me in. I can contact you this way in case of emergencies. Tingen City was too small. He couldn't stay long. But he couldn't lose contact with Klein. Klein was too weak, and it wouldn't be good if he accidentally died in some extraordinary event, causing the gray mist to disappear. Besides, Klein's tarot club was indeed quite interesting, a good way to gather intelligence. Alright, then you draw a card too. Klein hesitated for a moment, but finally conjured a tarot deck with the Fool, the Fallen Man, and Justice removed. It wasn't that he didn't trust George, but mainly that George knew his true situation, and it would be quite awkward to watch him play the Fool. Of course, the advantages were greater. With George knowing the situation, the two could sometimes cooperate to extract information. At the same time, George was very strong, a Sequence 7 magician with powerful physical strength. He could probably handle a Sequence 6 without a problem, and even have the chance against a Sequence 5. He would have a powerful ally. That suits me quite well. George casually drew a tarot card, and the card that read Strength appeared in his hand. The Strength card, the 8th card in the tarot deck, represents love and a strong will, meaning that you have the ability to solve the current difficult situation and are full of confidence in your inner strength. He was indeed full of confidence in his strength, both internal and external. Okay, from today onwards, my code name in your tarot club is Strength. Chapter 731 The Gaze of the Goddess of Night. After drawing the tarot cards, the two exchanged detailed information. George told Klein about the potion recipes for the Joker, the Magician, and the Faceless Man, as well as some information about the secret order he had obtained from the Joker's killer. Knowing the potion recipes early would allow Klein to quickly grow stronger and enter the core of the church. Being too weak would make him vulnerable to death. George also gained a lot of useful information from Klein, such as details from Roselle's notebook, the first and second blasphemous tablets, and historical accounts of the existence of extraordinary beings not recorded in historical texts. This gave him a more concrete understanding of the world. After exchanging information, the two discussed some details and then went their separate ways home. Meanwhile, in the astral realm, within the dark kingdom of gods, the goddess of night, Amanesis, was filled with doubt. What's going on with this George? As a deity, she had many important matters to attend to and couldn't possibly have time to watch over every believer. Even when believers prayed, unless they were specially marked, she generally wouldn't pay attention. Occasionally, when in a good mood, she might choose a few lucky believers to respond. But Klein was different. She had been paying close attention to him even before he became her follower. This was because, like Klein, she came from a prehistoric modern civilization. She was originally a high-ranking executive at a large company in Northern Europe, but was later kidnapped by the heavenly venerable Fusheng Xuanhuang, her soul suspended in the Source Castle for countless years. In the Second Era, she was placed into the body of a demonic wolf by the Source Castle, initially as a Sequence 2 hidden servant. During the Twin Era, she ascended to the throne of God, advancing to Sequence 0 Darkness of the Dark Path, becoming a true god. In the Third Era, she secretly preached, and at the end of the Fourth Era, she became one of the 7 great gods of the Northern Continent, moving her divine kingdom to the astral plane to resist the outer gods. Over the years, she also figured out the truth behind her being suspended in the Source Castle. Roughly speaking, the original creator created the world, but its main body malfunctioned, splitting into a group of powerful outer gods before entering Earth to slumber. During this slumber, its personality split into 6. They too were in a state of slumber, but began to indirectly and secretly interfere with and influence the real world using their power and extraordinary characteristics, making many preparations for the true division after the awakening of the primordial creator. Thus, many myths and legends were left on Earth. The 2 strongest of the 6 personalities were an omniscient and omnipotent god and the mysterious Lord of Fortune and Profound Yellow Heaven. To prevent his own demise in the struggle, the Lord of Fortune and Profound Yellow Heaven had long ago captured many souls in modern civilization and placed them in his Source Castle. If something happened to him, he would have the Source Castle release the souls, allowing him to be resurrected in the future. The prehistoric era ended, entering the Chaos Era, also known as the First Era. In the early stages, the primordial creator awakened, Earth's civilization was destroyed, and the 9 source matter and 22 divine paths, representing the primordial creator's power, also gathered on Earth. Some of the old days were absorbed from the starry sky by the primordial creator, and some of the source matter were activated to form the old days. Because of the schemes of the 6 personalities, the original creator died completely and split into 6, with the remaining power forming a barrier to prevent the outer gods from invading Earth. In the middle stage, after a great battle, the celestial venerable and god killed and devoured the remaining 4, obtaining 7 additional source essences. In the later stage, because they possessed too many source essences and could not control their instinct to merge, the 2 fought each other and both perished. God's remains transformed into the first profane tablet in the Chaos Sea, one of the 9 source essences. The cunning celestial venerable sealed all 7 source essences except for the Source Castle and the Chaos Sea in Asia, namely the Western continent. In the future, anyone on Earth who wants to advance from a true god to an old one must resurrect him, allowing him to break the seal and release the source essences. Incidentally, he also stuffed the erroneous uniqueness into God, hoping to prevent his mortal enemy from being resurrected. The first soul separated from the Source Castle in the Second Era was her, the goddess of night, because she did not choose the path of the thief, the diviner, or the apprentice to which the celestial venerable belonged, but instead chose night. Therefore, she did not inherit the Source Castle, nor did she allow the celestial venerable to awaken and be resurrected within her body. In the 5th Era, Yuan Bao, following the celestial's instructions, cast out a second soul, Emperor Rosal. Because Rosal hadn't chosen one of the celestial's 3 paths, the celestial couldn't awaken. A few months ago, Yuan Bao cast out a soul for the 3rd time, this time carrying the celestial's relic, the curtain. If successful, the 3rd soul would immediately inherit the curtain's power and become a mysterious servant of the diviner's path, Sequence 1. The celestial would then immediately possess and resurrect within the 3rd soul. Therefore, she used the uniqueness of the out-of-control half of Sequence 0 antagonist, sealed within her secret palace on the summit of Mount Hornicus, to deceive Yuan Bao. The third soul separated from the curtain, not going to the Forsaken Land, but entering the body of Klein, an ordinary person in Tenjin City who had just died due to the extraordinary event. Klein inherited Yuan Bao's power, chose the diviner's path, and might still be possessed by the celestial in the future. Therefore, her gaze never left Klein. This led her to see George, who wandered aimlessly in the night, possessing immense physical strength and claiming to be a transmigrator. She was certain that George did not originate from the Source Castle. The Source Castle had only housed 3 souls, her, Rosal, and Klein. Could it be from the Chaos Sea? The Celestial Venerable had left the Source Castle as a contingency plan, and God had similarly left the Chaos Sea. The Celestial Venerable had captured hundreds of human souls and suspended them in the Source Castle, while God had captured hundreds of souls with physical bodies and sunk them into the Chaos Sea. It's worth noting that the ancient sun god who destroyed the ancient gods, demons, dragons, and giants of the Second Era, unifying the entire Earth, was a modern human who crawled out of the Chaos Sea. No, if it were a modern human who crawled out of the Chaos Sea underground, then it should have a physical body, not just a soul possessing someone. The goddess of night, Amanesis, shook her head again, ruling out this possibility. At the same time, she was certain it wasn't a reincarnation through the fate path, nor a parasitic possession through the thief path. In the darkness, under her deliberate observation, neither of those could have escaped her notice. Furthermore, George absorbed the magician's traits, becoming a Sequence 7 magician through the diviner's pathway. Let's observe him first. After pondering for a moment, still without an answer, Amanesis temporarily set the matter aside. George's origins were strange, but at only Sequence 7, he wasn't yet worthy of her attention. She would observe him carefully, and sooner or later discover his hidden true identity. Her main focus now was on obtaining the uniqueness of the Grim Reaper and how to assassinate the god of war, seizing his unique and extraordinary traits for herself. Chapter 732 Lucky Draw. Finally, the gaze has left. George, returning home, felt the gaze from the night disappear, and a slight smile played on his lips. With his strength, he had sensed a gaze fixed on him ever since he encountered Klein. It was the power of the night, most likely the righteous god of Klein's Church of the Goddess of Night. However, when Klein pulled him into the gray mist space, the gaze vanished. Clearly, the power of the Goddess of Night couldn't penetrate the gray mist. This also indicated that Klein's gray mist didn't originate from the Goddess of Night, but rather from an existence even more powerful than her. Furthermore, the fact that the Goddess of Night had been watching Klein but hadn't done anything to him spoke volumes. The Goddess of Night definitely had some understanding of the true owner of the gray mist. Otherwise, logically, given that Klein possessed a gray mist space on par with divine power, the Goddess of Night would have seized it immediately upon discovery. Someone who could rise above the gods of previous eras to become one of the 7 righteous gods ruling the world couldn't be a pushover. This was one of the reasons he hadn't deliberately concealed his home address or other information about this world. Since it had already been exposed, there was no need to hide it. In the eyes of the Goddess of Night, he, like Klein, was at most a human who had accidentally arrived here from prehistoric times. Compared to Klein's gray mist space, whose power was on par with that of a true god, he was merely stronger and even less worthy of attention. Therefore, according to his prediction, the Goddess of Night shouldn't do anything to him. If his guess was wrong, and there were other hidden reasons, the Goddess of Night might want to kill him or capture and imprison him. The worst-case scenario would be taking Klein, his family, and his parents from this world into her own world. In her own world, she could control time at will. She could pause everyone's time first, and release them when things were resolved and it was safe. If things were so dire that they had to escape this world and enter chaos, then she could create planets and humans in her own world, accelerate their evolution to the modern era, and then put them in. For them, it would be equivalent to traveling to modern life, which wasn't so bad. As for herself, at least she had obtained a gray mist space, so this clone wasn't wasted. However, that was the worst-case scenario. The next day, in the morning, George's father, Jack Barton, dressed in a suit, kissed Chris and went to work as usual. Jack worked at the city hall. His job was easy and the pay was good. However, with Jack's salary, he couldn't have saved enough to buy the current house. Chris quit her job after becoming pregnant and became a full-time housewife, and Jack's salary could only maintain their family's current decent living expenses. The money Jack spent to buy the house was enough for him to work for 50 years without eating or drinking. So, the money to buy the house actually came mainly from the inheritance of Jack's father, that is, the grandfather of this body. From the couple's casual conversation, it was learned that the grandfather of this body used to work in Backlund. His employer was one of the most prestigious earls in the kingdom today. This was why the two considered going directly to Backlund if the previous investment made money. Because the Barton family had some connections in Backlund. If they spent enough money, Jack could be promoted and transferred to the Backlund City Hall, with a significant salary increase, and he could also settle down in Backlund. Unfortunately, she'd run into a swindler. Forget about making big money, even the £150 she'd saved after buying the house was gone. So she continued working honestly at the Tingen City Hall, slowly earning money to support her family. After Jack left for work, Chris tidied the house and then took her stroller for her usual walk. Thanks to Jack's comfort yesterday, Chris's mood had improved considerably. Don't miss out. A lucky draw is in full swing. Only 1 penny is needed to participate. The grand prize is £150 in cash. Not far down the street, Chris's eyes were drawn to a makeshift stall. A lucky draw was underway, and a large crowd was gathered around, creating a lively atmosphere. Normally, she wouldn't mind spending a few pounds to try her luck. She knew she couldn't win the grand prize, but sometimes she'd win some plush toys, although most of those toys weren't worth the money she spent on the draw. However, this time, she didn't plan to participate. Having just been swindled out of £150, she wasn't in the mood and didn't want to waste another penny. Special offer today. All mothers with children can enter a free lucky draw. Just as Chris was about to leave the stall, a new call came from there. The words free lucky draw made her hesitate. At this moment, George suddenly cried out from his crib, waving his little hands and pointing towards the stall, seemingly very interested. Seeing this, Chris smiled and pushed the crib over. It seems my little darling wants to participate in the lucky draw, so let him have a turn. Madam, would you like to enter the lucky draw? Your first entry with your child is free. Seeing Chris pushing the crib over, the owner of the event immediately brightened up. Chris nodded with some surprise after seeing the owner's appearance. Then let's draw one. Can my little one draw? This owner looked too burly, not like a carpet shop owner, more like a bodyguard. Of course, no problem. The owner enthusiastically took dozens of lottery tickets from a marked box and handed them to the crib. George looked at the familiar face and pretended to swat one of the tickets away haphazardly. The burly owner was none other than the sailor who had been part of the group that had fought alongside Swain to take down the out-of-control individuals. Chris picked up the lottery ticket George had knocked away and casually scratched it. She didn't have high hopes. These lottery stalls couldn't possibly have big prizes, and even if they did, they were just actors. She'd be happy if she won a plush toy for her child. This is the grand prize. However, when she scratched off the ticket and saw the words, she was completely stunned. Grand prize. Congratulations to this lady for winning the grand prize, £150 in cash. The owner casually tore off the remaining tickets and stuffed them into his pocket. Then, as if he had been expecting this, took out £150 from another box and placed it in the still bewildered Chris's hand. Chris stared in disbelief at the £150 in cash in his hand, muttering incredulously, I won. I won £150. At that moment, George gave a thumbs up to the sailor who was looking at him. And the sailor grinned, revealing his pearly white teeth. Chapter 733 The Mysterious Eldest Cousin. 1 gold pound could be exchanged for 20 sulphurs, and 1 sulfranch for 12 pennies. According to George's observation, 1 penny was roughly equivalent to $4 in purchasing power in his world. Therefore, £150 was roughly equivalent to $150,000. For a middle-class family that had just bought a house and didn't have much savings, $150,000 was a considerable sum. Now, thanks to the lottery, Chris had regained £150, which made her ecstatic. It's been said that there are 3 happiest things in life: a false alarm, a long-awaited reunion, and something lost. Chris was experiencing something that was lost and then regained. The £150 she had been cheated out of were all back. She excitedly hugged George and showered him with kisses, marveling at the luck he had brought her and how he had won the grand prize. Darling, you're truly your family's lucky star. With the £150 in cash, Chris and George immediately hailed a carriage to the bank and deposited the money. Then she couldn't wait to go to the town hall to tell her husband the good news. But thinking that her husband was at work and that going there rashly might cause problems, she calmed down and decided to tell him after he got off work that evening. "I'm going to see my older sister. It's been a while since I've been there, and I'll also check on how Megas is doing." Since she couldn't see her husband, she decided to share her joy with her sister. So she immediately bought some gifts and took George in a carriage to her older sister's house. Megas, that older cousin who was tricked into getting pregnant, lying in his crib. George recalled the information about his aunt and cousin in this body, but didn't pay too much attention, continuing to study spiritual energy and magician abilities with his eyes closed. As a baby, sleeping with eyes closed was normal, and no one would suspect anything. By the time the carriage arrived at his aunt's house, it was almost noon. His aunt naturally welcomed Chris's arrival. Her daughter, Megas, refused to abort the swindler's child, which gave her a headache. She hoped that Chris, her aunt, could persuade her. Just as his mother Chris and aunt were chatting and preparing lunch, George, who had been pretending to be asleep, suddenly opened his eyes. He slightly raised his head, looking at Megas sitting on the sofa in front of him, touching her belly with a strange smile, and his brows furrowed slightly. Although he hadn't used his mental powers to investigate, as someone comparable to Trigad on this world, he instinctively sensed that something was wrong with Megas. Megas's soul gave him the same feeling as the out-of-control sailor before. More importantly, there was the developing fetus in Megas's belly. It wasn't an ordinary fetus, but one containing various evil and negative energies such as shadow, darkness, corruption, filth, and mutation. Is some evil god going to descend through Megas's belly? Combining the information he had gathered about this world, George had already made a guess. It seems that the liar is not only a liar, but also a cultist. Lying back down in the crib, George closed his eyes again. He didn't intend to ignore it. If he did, and the evil god really descended, it wouldn't just be Megas who would be affected, but the entire city of Tingen would be doomed. But he wouldn't act immediately. Because right now, he could only use the power of a magician. At most modified and enhanced by himself. There was no way to kill this evil god while ensuring Megas's safety. He needed time to convert his power into spiritual energy, and ideally, to learn more about the mystical knowledge of this world. This way, he would be confident in using sealing magic in the way this world operated. The best way to deal with an evil god who had bestowed a trace of power was, of course, to seal it away. Perhaps he could even use that trace of evil god's power to glean some useful information. Anyway, given Megas's pregnancy, the evil god's birth was at least 10 months away. There was plenty of time. Meanwhile, on the outskirts of Tingen, in a room with a verdant lawn, a withering garden, and a dark red chimney, a middle-aged man in a double-breasted, pure black clergy robe was flipping through a notebook. Sealed Artifact 2-049 has arrived in Tingen. Real Beeper has become a monster. The Night Watchers were attacked by the Secret Order while dealing with a monster Beeper. A mysterious infant of unknown identity easily killed a magician from the Secret Order and stole his extraordinary abilities. That mysterious infant is actually Megas's cousin, and seems to have sensed some of Megas's abnormalities. The middle-aged man looked at the last entries in his notebook, his face grave. Trouble. I can't let this guy disrupt my plans. Kill him. I'll find a way to get rid of him. Easily killing a magician as an infant before even stealing his abilities. This infant's true strength is definitely not simple. Moreover, the church is paying close attention. A rash attack would likely have a greater impact on his plans. He picked up the quill and wrote in his notebook. Marcus, who was about to be promoted and transferred to Backland, suddenly fell ill and could no longer work. So the mayor decided to give the position to Jack Barton. The Barton family will move to Backland in a week. This makes sense, because Jack Barton has always been very capable. In addition, the mayor inadvertently learned that the Barton family has some connection with the Earl of Hall in Backland. That should solve the problem. The middle-aged man put away the quill with satisfaction. His name was Int Zangwil, originally the Archbishop of the Church of the Night. After failing to ascend to the Sequence 4 Undead, he absconded with the Church's 0-08 seal artifact. The series of events that happened in Tingen were all secretly orchestrated by him using the 0-08 seal artifact. His purpose was to bring the true creator of the evil god to Tingen and destroy all the defenses here. Then, he would take the opportunity to steal the ashes of Saint Selena, who was stationed inside the Night Watch, convert to the Dark Path, and ascend to the Sequence 4 Night Watch, becoming a demigod. The sealed artifact in his hand, number 0-08, is called the Pen of Alshigad, and its appearance is that of an ordinary quill pen. However, if a story is written with it, that story will become reality. This sealed artifact possesses extremely strong power. Someone once even used a story written with it to murder a Sequence 2 angel. And the more powerful the sealed artifact, the stronger its negative effects tend to be. This sealed artifact is no exception. Chapter 734 The Senior Deacon's Appointment. 0 and 8 Sealed Artifact, the Pen of Alshigad, is that every previous owner and researcher of it died from strange causes. No evidence has been found of it directly harming those who come into contact with it. It will suddenly begin writing on its own, even when it has an owner. Its owner often wakes up one day to find themselves in horror as the protagonist of a strange story, which cannot be changed by erasing the ink or tearing up the paper. Statistically, there is a 7% chance that such a story is absurd and funny, a 12% chance that it is terrifying and horrific, and a 10% chance that it is both. In the afternoon, Chris took George away from his older sister's house and returned to their own home. In the evening, after Jack got off work, Chris told Jack about winning £150 in a lottery, and Jack told Chris about his upcoming promotion and move to Backland. After celebrating, the two decided to sell their old house and their new house within a week and move to Backland with all the money. George, lying in his crib, didn't seem bothered by this. He had originally planned to go to Backland. Tingen was too small, lacking the resources and intelligence he needed. Even without this incident, he intended to find an opportunity later to get help from the two churches to transfer Jack to Backland. Late at night, George didn't go out for a stroll. Instead, as during the day, he calmly continued his research on transforming his strength, especially how to use the spiritual energy and rituals of this world to cast his improved sealing magic. However, his reluctance to go out didn't mean no one was looking for him. The familiar gray mist power surged in. It was Klein pulling him into the gray mist space. What's wrong? George noticed Klein's expression was off as soon as his soul entered the gray mist space. Klein quickly said, "A high deacon named Crest Sesima has arrived at the sanctuary. He's said to be one of the 9 high deacons." It turned out that as soon as Dunn returned yesterday, he telegraphed the situation to headquarters, and headquarters reacted quickly. This morning, a high deacon was sent by train to Tingen, arriving at the Night Watcher's base that evening. Similarly, the Church of the Lord of Storms also sent a high-ranking deacon to Tingen. After some discussion, both sides decided to meet George at the docks. The main purpose was to check if George was possessed by an evil god and if he had any unspeakable secrets. If he was possessed, they would eliminate him together at the less crowded docks. If not, they would see if he could be recruited into the church. Currently, Captain Dunn of the Night Watch and Captain Jane of the Punishers were on their way to George's house by carriage. Klein entered the gray mist space at the docks under the pretext of using the restroom, informing George of the situation beforehand so he could prepare. "Don't worry, there won't be any problems." George wasn't surprised by the news and reassured Klein before leaving the gray mist space. Even if several true gods came, without him actively revealing his power, they would only be able to tell he was a Sequence 7 magician. Therefore, he wasn't afraid of the two high-ranking deacons' tests. Moreover, he truly had no connection to any evil god. About half an hour after leaving the gray mist space, a strange energy suddenly invaded his body. Because it meant no harm, George didn't stop it. Under the influence of this force, he quickly entered the dream. Is this the ability of a Sequence 7 nightmare? Seeing Captain Dunn of the Night Watch appear before him, George revealed an expression of certainty. He had heard Klein mention Dunn's ability during their conversation yesterday. A Sequence 7 nightmare of the Dark Sequence could forcibly pull enemies into a dream within 100 meters, thus creating an opportunity for teammates to kill them. However, Dunn's pulling him in was clearly not for attacking him. "Good evening, Captain Dunn." "Good evening, Mr. George. Senior deacons from our church and the Church of the Storm Lord wish to see you." Seeing that George was completely unaffected by entering the dream, Dunn showed a hint of surprise, but quickly recovered and stated his purpose. If George were truly only a Sequence 7, he would definitely not be able to remain conscious after being pulled into the dream. Therefore, their judgment was correct. George was definitely not just a Sequence 7. "No problem." George, who already knew the situation, nodded. With a jolt of his soul, he directly escaped the dream, got up, and leaped out of the window, landing on the street outside. 2 people were standing on the street. One was Dunn, the captain of the Night Watch, and the other was Jane, the captain of the Punishers. Behind them was a carriage that had been prepared in advance. He rode a carriage to a secluded riverside spot near the dock, where a group of people were already waiting for him. The group was divided into two camps, left and right, and none of them were ordinary people. They were all extraordinary beings. Klein was in the left camp. "It's like a trap," George said, shaking his head with a smile after getting off the carriage, unfazed by the scene before him. He knew this was intentionally orchestrated by the two deacons. The purpose was simple: to give this wild extraordinary being a sufficient shock, to make him understand the power of the church. But this was clearly useless against him. He walked lightly forward, waving casually to the two men standing in the middle. "Good evening, deacons." The two high-ranking deacons and the members of the Night Watch and Punishers couldn't help but show strange expressions as they watched the small George approach. To be honest, it was the first time they had ever seen such a strange scene. They'd seen plenty of infants transformed into monsters by extraordinary forces. But an infant waving and greeting them like a little adult was something they'd never encountered before. The infant was even wearing open-crotch pants, though a cloak covered them. The scene suddenly felt strange. "Good evening," the two high-ranking deacons exchanged a glance and responded. However, their attitudes were noticeably different. The high-ranking deacon from the Church of the Goddess of Night was more gentle, appearing very calm. If it weren't for his conspicuous position, he would easily be overlooked. The high-ranking deacon from the Church of the Lord of Storms, on the other hand, was very assertive, his tone unconsciously carrying a sense of superiority and scrutiny. This wasn't just due to their different personalities, but also influenced by their respective pathways. The Dark Path emphasizes secrecy, so most members are relatively calm. The Tyrant Path corresponds to the Storm's authority, and most members are very volatile and act in extreme ways. If you are listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means it was downloaded and re-uploaded without effort. We warmly invite you to visit our channel, Fanfic World. There you will find the original version of this story and many other novels of various genres. We look forward to seeing you dive into a world of incredible novels. Chapter 735 Routine Inspection. The two churches' characteristics are particularly evident in their handling of supernatural events. For example, if an unknown supernatural event occurs in a village, the Night Watchers, when handling the case, typically conduct a covert investigation to find the source and resolve the matter while ensuring the safety of ordinary people as much as possible. Ideally, the ordinary people wouldn't even realize they experienced a supernatural event. It would appear as a simple murder. In the worst-case scenario, they would rather let the extraordinary individual who created the event escape than compromise the safety of ordinary people. However, if the Punishers take over, it's a different story. The Punishers don't care about such considerations. They basically go all out, preferring to kill the innocent rather than let the guilty go free, even at the cost of some ordinary people. They might even raise the entire village to the ground to completely resolve the issue. The names of the two churches' extraordinary individual teams offer a clue. One is called the Night Watchers, focusing on protection. The other is called the Punishers, focusing on punishment. As for which approach is right or wrong, that's a matter of opinion. In George's view, for ordinary individuals, the Night Watchers are better, but for the group as a whole, the Punishers are superior. The Night Watchers' methods protect ordinary people to the greatest extent, but increase the chance of letting extraordinary individuals escape, potentially causing greater disasters later. Moreover, protecting ordinary people can easily lead to Night Watchers being injured or killed, weakening their own power. The Punishers' methods, while resulting in the deaths of a few, can eliminate the enemy to the greatest extent possible without causing secondary damage. It also greatly deters wild extraordinary individuals and troublesome cultists. At the same time, because they don't have to worry too much about ordinary people, Punishers themselves are less likely to be injured or killed. Of course, as a wild extraordinary individual now, he definitely prefers the Night Watchers. Because he can clearly feel that the high-ranking deacons of the Church of the Night treat him much better than the high-ranking deacons of the Storm Lord. If he hadn't rescued a sailor of the Storm Lord, the high-ranking deacon's attitude would probably be even worse, and he might not even have been allowed to speak with him. He might have just forcibly arrested him and subjected him to various checks, tests, and interrogations. "What brings you two here?" George cut to the chase without any formalities. Crest Sesama, a high-ranking deacon of the Church of the Goddess of Night, smiled and replied, "Don't misunderstand, we mean no harm. It's just a routine check. Given your rather unusual situation, in your case, we usually arrest you first and then test you. We're only giving you a chance because you helped a substitute for someone in punishment," added Radar Valentine, a high-ranking deacon of the Church of the Lord of Storms, his tone imposing. The two of them, one playing the good cop and the other the bad cop, gave George the impression that one was playing the bad cop and the other the bad cop. However, this might not be due to their coordinated actions or deliberate manipulation. Rather, it was simply that their individual characteristics created this effect. George didn't seem to care. "It's all right. Do whatever you want to do." Seeing George's decisiveness, the two didn't waste any more words and began to use their methods. Cress took down the silver white box from her back, quickly opened it, revealing a meter-long pure white bone sword. The bone sword was clearly no ordinary weapon. Its appearance seemed to draw all the surrounding light into it. The goddess's sword, Radar, standing beside him, couldn't help but exclaim. Both were high-ranking deacons, but Radar was a Sequence 4 Calamity High Priest, a true demigod-level powerhouse with his own mythological form. Crest A, on the other hand, was only a Sequence 5 Spirit Witch, a full level lower. This wasn't just a minor level difference. Sequence 4 represented a qualitative leap, truly possessing divinity, making one half human, half god. However, in reality, if the two were to fight, the outcome was uncertain. The reason lay in the goddess's sword in Creste's hand. It was a sacred relic bestowed by the goddess of night, capable of greatly enhancing Creste's power and even allowing him to communicate with the goddess to a certain extent. Lightning flashed in his eyes, and Creste also unleashed his divinity to examine George. No other power, indeed a Sequence 7 magician. After a moment, Radar's eyes dimmed, revealing a look of doubt. In truth, the church didn't believe George's previous claims. After receiving the telegram from the Punisher of Tinjin City, the church's higher-ups believed that George was highly likely the offspring and power projection of some evil god. It's also possible that it's a parasitic entity of the souls of some angels or demigods from previous centuries. That's why he, the Deep Blue High Priest with Sequence 4 strength, was sent personally with a 0-82 sealed artifact. However, he didn't find anything abnormal on George. So he turned his attention to Creste. Although Creste was one sequence lower than him, the goddess's sword was a sacred object. Using the goddess's sword to examine was equivalent to the goddess herself examining him. Not to mention any offspring of an evil god, projections of evil god power, or remnants of angelic or demigod souls, even the descent of an evil god in its true form couldn't escape detection. To his surprise, Creste opened her eyes and shook her head at him. "It really is only Sequence 7, Radar's face showed an incredulous expression. Even the goddess couldn't see any other power on George, which meant that what George said was true. He was indeed a Sequence 7 magician. The ability to restore the out-of-control individuals was indeed because he had improved the magician's damage transfer ability. But this couldn't explain why he, at only 6 months old, possessed intelligence comparable to an adult. It was equally inexplicable why George could reach Sequence 7 magician status at just 6 months old. If George were an adult, or even a teenager, they could accept it. Geniuses exist in every era, and it's not uncommon for teenagers to reach Sequence 7. But to reach Sequence 7 at just 6 months old was pure nonsense. "Deacon, is there a problem?" At this moment, the retired Swain asked Radar somewhat nervously. Although he had retired, he had only stepped down from the front lines and was still a member of the church. Especially since this matter involved him, he was bound to come. He genuinely hoped that George, who had saved his teammate, was all right. Radar was silent for a moment, then nodded. "After testing, George Barton is fine." His answer immediately relieved Klein of the Night Watch team. Klein didn't want his newly acquainted fellow countrymen to be killed by the two major churches. At the same time, he was also glad that it was George who was being checked. If it had been him, he was really afraid that his gray mist space would be exposed. He really didn't know how to explain that. Chapter 736. His body is so powerful. I know my current situation is hard for others to understand, and to be honest, I can't explain it myself. After the two finished examining him, George stepped forward and said, "Since birth, I've discovered that I'm different from ordinary people. I can grasp both language and writing instantly. And I was born with an extremely powerful body. I became a Sequence 7 magician because I accidentally killed that magician from the secret order and consumed his extracted extraordinary characteristics. The first part was fabricated, but the second part was all true. killed a Sequence 7 magician with just a powerful body, the two high-ranking deacons looked doubtful again. In fact, being born precocious isn't entirely impossible, but being born strong and killing a Sequence 7 magician with just physical strength is unlikely. A Sequence 7 magician has mastered many types of magical abilities. How could he be killed with just his physical body? Unless he was a high sequence powerhouse on the warrior path. But according to George, he wasn't an extraordinary when he killed the magician, he became an extraordinary after consuming his extraordinary characteristics. If you two don't believe me, we can have a spar. I truly possess superhuman strength, you'll understand once you experience it for yourselves that I'm not lying, George said sincerely. He had three purposes in seeking a spar with the two high-ranking deacons of the church. First, to demonstrate his power, to show the church that he was not to be trifled with. If the two major churches resorted to extreme measures, he might retaliate. The two high-ranking deacons had summoned him to the docks in the middle of the night to intimidate him, to make him understand that he was nothing compared to the church's power. He needed to cooperate obediently with the inspection and accept the church's arrangements. However, if he could defeat the two high-ranking deacons, this intimidation would be useless. Instead, it would make the church understand that George cooperated with the inspection not because he was intimidated by the church, but entirely because he was a good, lawful, and extraordinary being. This would make future contact and cooperation with the two major churches much smoother. Second, he could also take the opportunity to digest the magician's potion and experience the feeling after digesting it. The magician's potion digestion method involves actively performing, challenging the impossible, and maximizing audience applause. He's currently performing actively. Fighting Sequence 7 against Sequence 5 and Sequence 4 is challenging the impossible within the impossible. Once he defeats the two high-ranking deacons, it will undoubtedly astonish everyone in both churches. In this way, he can digest the potion completely in one go. Yesterday, during his discussion with Klein, the two summarized the principles of role-playing and the speed of potion digestion, concluding it should be related to the target. The stronger the target, the better the effect. However, the stronger the target, the faster the death. Thirdly, and finally, he also wanted to see the level of the high-sequence powerhouses in this world. Let's try it out with those two first, Radar said, pointing to Dunn and Jane. He thought George's suggestion was fine, but challenging him and Creste to duel was a bit presumptuous. However, it was understandable, if what George himself said was true. Then George didn't actually know much about extraordinary beings. Some of this knowledge came from the magician of that secret order. He might not yet fully grasp the terrifying difference between Sequence 4 and Sequence 7. In his eyes, Sequence 7 was as weak as an ant. Therefore, it was more appropriate to let the two captains handle it. Although they were Sequence 7, they already possessed strength approaching Sequence 6. The two of them working together against George would also allow them to see if George's physical body was truly as powerful as he claimed. Dunn looked at Crestel, who silently nodded, and didn't object to Radar. Radar was a high-ranking deacon of the Lord of Storms, not a high-ranking deacon of the Goddess of Night, so he couldn't command him. Alright, George shrugged indifferently. Defeating the two captains first, then the two high-ranking deacons, would likely create a better performance. Dunn and Jane stood opposite George, and without exchanging words, they began their coordinated battle. As captains of the extraordinary squads from the two major churches in Tingen City, they had dealt with each other countless times and were quite familiar with each other's abilities. Therefore, they didn't need to communicate at all to achieve perfect teamwork. Dunn pressed his hand to his brow, closed his eyes, and seemed to fall asleep, but in reality, he had already activated his nightmare ability to drag George into a dream. The Nightmare of the Night Path, Sequence 7, possessed decent melee abilities, but its most powerful attribute was its ability to control and drag enemies into dreams. The moment Dunn activated his ability, Jane's muscles swelled, and with a powerful leap, he charged towards George like a tank. The Tyrant Path, Sequence 7, called Navigator, further enhanced his physical strength while already possessing some water magic. Jane intended to take advantage of the moment Dunn controlled George to deliver a fatal blow. However, facing Dunn's dream entry, George didn't let it go as he had at home this time. He directly used his powerful soul to isolate the dream entering ability from his body. His body swayed, as if he had moved away briefly, yet also as if he hadn't. Jane, charging towards him, and Dunn, who was casting the dream entering ability, almost simultaneously received a heavy blow to the back of their heads, their eyes rolling back as they collapsed unconscious. What? The members of the Night Watch and Punisher Squad widened their eyes in disbelief. They hadn't even seen what happened, they only saw George's body sway slightly, and yet the two captains had fallen to the ground. The two high-ranking deacons also narrowed their eyes and couldn't help but take a step forward. They had seen the battle very clearly. George hadn't used any extraordinary power, he had simply relied on his powerful body to attack the two captains one by one with terrifying speed and strength. His attack method was to circle around behind them and strike them on the back of the head. After attacking, he returned to his position. It was just that the speed was too fast, and the Sequence 9 and Sequence 8 members hadn't seen it clearly at all. Even the two captains probably hadn't seen it clearly either, otherwise they wouldn't have been too late to even take any defensive stance. His body is so powerful, at this moment, they completely believed George's words. That magician from the Secret Order would definitely not be able to withstand a single move from George. Even the two of them, without using extraordinary power, were not on the same level as George in terms of physical strength. Are there really people in the world who are born with extraordinary talents? Chapter 737. It's time to show our true power. Let's spar, you two. Having just defeated Dunn and Jane in front of everyone, most of the potion in his body had been digested. George immediately extended another invitation to Krusty and Rilda to spar. Alright, let's see just how strong your body really is. Krusty and Rilda exchanged a glance, neither refusing. To be honest, seeing the power and speed George had just displayed, they weren't confident they could completely overpower him individually. So when George asked them to spar this time, they didn't refuse out of politeness. On one hand, they needed to test the limits of George's body so they could determine their next move based on his strength. On the other hand, they wanted George to understand that while his body was indeed powerful, it was nothing compared to the truly powerful Church. Perhaps he possessed power comparable to Sequence 4, but the Church wasn't just one Sequence 4, two Sequence 4s could easily suppress him. Above Sequence 4 were Sequence 3 and Sequence 2. Moreover, the Church of the True God wasn't just one, but 7. They couldn't let George underestimate the Church, they needed to instill in him a sense of awe. This would make recruitment easier later. Since George passed the test and even the goddess didn't find anything unusual, he could be recruited into the Church and made an extraordinary being. With such a powerful body at only 6 months old, he would undoubtedly be a pillar of the Church in the future. The two captains were awakened, and they were instructed to lead their respective teams to clear out any ordinary people who might be nearby. Then the battle began. A battle at the demigod level could easily destroy a city like Tingen with its aftershocks. Even if the two deacons tried their best to restrain themselves during their sparring to prevent their power from leaking out and causing harm, the scene would still be absolutely terrifying. Sure enough, as soon as the battle began, Radar flew directly into the air, and with a casual wave of his hand, violent lightning descended from the sky, striking George. The Tyrant Path Sequence 6 allows for short-distance levitation, and Sequence 4 greatly enhances flight ability. The reason this Sequence 4 of this path is called the Calamity Priest is that once he activates his ability, it's no different from a natural disaster. George found this Tyrant Path interesting, initially focusing on physical enhancement, comparable to the Warrior Path. It became a top-tier archmage at higher sequences. The raging lightning overhead was no less powerful than the lightning magic of a top-tier lightning mage in the fairy tale world. Of course, with George's physical body and his superpower to control lightning, even without defense, the lightning would hardly harm him. However, he naturally wouldn't let the lightning strike him. On one hand, he feared that taking the lightning head-on unscathed would be too terrifying for the two deacons. On the other hand, he also considered that since he couldn't use his abilities now, being struck would mean his clothes would be completely reduced to ashes, even if his body was unharmed. Fighting naked would be quite unsightly, even though his current body was that of a 6-month-old infant. In a flash, just as the lightning was about to strike him, he anticipated it and successfully dodged. But just as he dodged, a pure white bone sword came crashing down on him. It was Creste, wielding the goddess sword, who blocked his way. The coordination between the two high-ranking deacons was completely opposite to that of the two captains. Just now, Dunn of the Night Path was in charge of ranged control, while Jane of the Tyrant Path was in charge of close combat. Now, Creste of the Night Path is in charge of close combat, while Rhoda of the Tyrant Path is in charge of ranged control. This speed can't hurt me. Facing the attack of the goddess's sword, George's lips curled up slightly, and he was about to dodge the attack. However, at this moment, for some reason, his foot slipped, and his body instantly lost its balance, making it impossible to make an effective dodge. No way, with his control over his body, how could he make such a low-level mistake? My fate has been shifted. In an instant, George realized what had happened. Just as he was preparing to dodge, the goddess's sword subtly shifted his fate, causing him to be afflicted with misfortune in that instant, which led to this low-level mistake of slipping. Interesting, he was becoming more and more interested in the high-sequence abilities of this world. I wonder what kind of abilities a high-sequence diviner would have, since he couldn't dodge. George simply didn't dodge, and with lightning speed, flicked the side of the goddess's sword. The powerful force instantly deflected the goddess' sword's attack trajectory, slashing past him to the side, and he used the momentum to leap away. However, halfway through his jump, a massive wind blade slashed down at him from above. That wind blade originated from radar. Crack! In mid-air, George slammed his hands together, creating a powerful gust of wind that instantly met the wind blade, shattering it on the spot. What? Seeing that George had broken his wind blade in such an unbelievable way, Radar couldn't help but widen his eyes in disbelief. Night. Just as George landed, Creste's attack came again. Compared to the initial probing attack, Creste didn't hold back this time. His face was sullen, holding the goddess sword, his spiritual energy surging wildly into the blade, and he slashed vertically down from 5 meters away from George. The goddess sword seemed to transform into a black hole, sucking in boundless light and emitting a quiet yet dangerous darkness that spread towards George. At the same time, powerful spirits emerged from Creste's body, disappearing into the darkness and making it even more dangerous. This was one of Creste's abilities as a Sequence 5 spirit shaman. Combined with the power of the goddess's sword, once the darkness enveloped the enemy, even a Sequence 4 demigod would be affected, pulled into the depths of darkness by those spirits, and gradually fall into slumber. We won. Radar, who was preparing to continue his attack from the sky, stopped when he saw Creste was serious. George's strength lay in his physical body, and Creste's attack method was the nemesis of those extraordinary individuals who relied on close-quarters combat. The boundless darkness was inescapable, no matter how fast George was. And attacks targeting the soul were difficult for George to resist, no matter how strong his body was. So he probably didn't need to intervene anymore. However, if it weren't for his restraint, given George's speed and strength, Creste probably wouldn't have been able to launch an attack of this level so smoothly. That's an interesting move. Looks like it's time to show some real power. Seeing the darkness engulfing him and sensing the danger within, George stretched his limbs, preparing to counterattack. Actually, he could use his modified fire magic to escape the encirclement or defend himself. However, this sparring session was primarily about showcasing physical strength, so he planned to use a different method. Chapter 738 Holy crap, Pegasus Meteor Fist. Drink, George roared, his voice exploding like thunder on the dock, the powerful sonic wave sweeping rapidly towards Creste. Creste, caught in the sonic wave, froze, a look of pain on his face, his spiritual energy instantly thrown into chaos. This also slowed the darkness enveloping George. Taking advantage of this moment, George stomped his feet on the ground, instantly shattering it into pieces, sending large rocks flying into the air. Go! George's body blurred into after images, using the rocks as soccer balls and Creste as the goal, unleashing a barrage of attacks. Under George's terrifying power, the rocks' speed soared beyond the speed of sound. The friction between the rocks and the air even sparked flames. To the night watchmen and punishers on the perimeter, they were no longer rocks, but terrifying meteors engulfed in flames. Your golden right foot, Klein muttered to himself, marveling at George's monstrous physique. Danger, Creste, who had just recovered from the sonic attack, paled. He could no longer afford to continue activating darkness and spirits, but instead withdrew all his spiritual power, channeling it all into the goddess's sword. If he were to try to drag George into the darkness now, he would likely be crushed by George's meteor before the darkness even enveloped him. Seeing Creste's attack interrupted and forced to defend, Rhoda in the sky was also busy. His extensive combat experience told him that if he didn't use his full strength today, he would likely be defeated by George. If they couldn't defeat George in a 2-on-1 fight, he and Creste, The two high-ranking deacons would be disgraced. Moreover, they would lose the initiative in the subsequent conversation. Charge! 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 A roar completely different from George's echoed throughout Tenjin City, and the water in the river beside the dock transformed into a giant hand, grabbing towards George. At the same time, Rilda's eyes turned wide, and countless lightning bolts enveloped George. This wasn't the end. A terrifying tornado rose from the ground, enveloping the lightning and water in its center, forming a wind barrier to prevent George from escaping and to prevent energy leakage from harming innocents. No wonder he's called a demigod. He certainly has the bearing of a god. Enveloped by the triple forces of wind, water, and lightning, George showed no fear. Instead, his eyes lit up. He wasn't afraid of a world's strength, but rather its weakness, which offered him no benefit. If a demigod possessed such power, then a true god might be even stronger than he had anticipated, meaning that when he reached Sequence 0, he would also gain even greater power than expected. Although his other avatars were also devouring worlds, gaining even more benefits, absorbing and merging an entire world was not something that could be done in a short time. Normally, several decades or even 100 years would be considered fast. Even with his various avatars constantly increasing in strength and interacting, it would still take at least 10 or 8 years. But this world, if things went quickly, he might be able to reach Sequence 0 in just a few years, becoming stronger and allowing his avatars in other worlds to devour and merge with it even faster. Unfortunately, this kind of direct elemental attack is even less effective against me. George, amidst the lightning, clenched his right fist, took a deep breath, and, like a colossal beast swallowing the sky, caused the tornado maintaining the barrier to shake violently. Give me a break. He unleashed a powerful punch, the terrifying force generating immense pressure, and a transparent fist of air transformed into a dragon, soaring into the sky. It instantly dispersed all of Radar's water palm, lightning, and tornado. George then leaped to a position even higher than Rilda, revealing a slightly malicious smile. Da. His pinkish white fists fired like a machine gun, each air punch landing on the wide-eyed, still unresponsive Rilda. Holy crap, Pegasus Meteor Fist, Klein couldn't help but mentally curse again. Then he saw Rilda, like a meteorite, crash down on Crest A, who had just shattered the fiery stones, sending both of them tumbling to the ground. Stop fighting. Stop fighting. Rilda and Crest A, bruised and battered, got up and, seeing George charging at them again after landing, quickly waved their hands to stop the fight. Through the previous battle, they understood that with George's monstrous physique, they were no match for him. At least a Sequence 3, and even then, it was uncertain whether they could win. It seems the two deacons believe what I said. George stopped and lowered his fists. He could feel that the potion in his body had been completely digested, indicating his performance was successful. We believe you, the two nodded in unison. The sparring ended, and George and the two high-ranking deacons began a real exchange. This time, however, it wasn't in the open space outside the docks, nor was it like an interrogation. Instead, they sat in a private, luxurious room at the Dragon Bar, exchanging views face-to-face on equal terms. This was the difference in treatment between people of different strengths. Regarding Mr. George's current situation, we are currently unable to determine the exact cause. However, you can join our church, and through the church, we can gradually help you find the reason. Crest A extended an invitation to George first. If George were truly Sequence 3 or Sequence 2, Crest A wouldn't have dared to easily invite him to join the church. Because those strong individuals in that sequence are generally either high-ranking members of some organization or incarnations or offspring of evil gods. But George is different. He is clearly Sequence 7, and has passed the goddess's test, possessing innate intelligence and physical strength. Bringing him into the church would be equivalent to adding another powerful expert. More importantly, George is in the diviner sequence, not the dark sequence, so his later advancement wouldn't consume the extraordinary characteristics of the dark sequence. At his level, he naturally knows many secrets unknown to ordinary extraordinary individuals. For example, the 3 laws of extraordinary characteristics, the law of the indestructibility of extraordinary characteristics, the law of the aggregation of extraordinary characteristics, and the law of conservation of extraordinary characteristics. The law of the indestructibility of extraordinary characteristics states that extraordinary characteristics will not be destroyed or diminished, they simply transfer from one carrier to another. The law of extraordinary attribute aggregation states that high sequence items within the same sequence will indirectly and unconsciously attract mid to low sequence extraordinary individuals to their vicinity. These items tend to aggregate together, and high sequence items can detect this attraction. Similar attraction exists along adjacent pathways. The law of conservation of extraordinary attributes states that extraordinary attributes are conserved along adjacent pathways. As high sequence items increase, low sequence items decrease. Each pathway can have at most one sequence 0 or 3 sequence 1 items. Sequence 0 and sequence 1 cannot coexist. Chapter 739 The First Tarot Meeting. For the Church, their God is sequence 0. Therefore, there are no sequence 1s of the same path within the Church. At most, there are only sequence 2s and subsequent sequences. Take the Church of the Goddess of Night as an example. Since the Goddess of Night already exists, there will be no sequence 1 Calamity Knights within the Church, or even in the entire world. There will only be sequence 2 hidden servants. Moreover, if there are too many sequence 3s and 4s within the Church, the number of lower sequence individuals will decrease. This is because there are only so many extraordinary traits for the Night path. This is also why, after the death of an extraordinary individual in the Church, their extraordinary traits are reclaimed regardless of the cost. This is why the Church would allow its extraordinary individuals to choose other paths. George is on the diviner path. Even if he advances in the future, he will not occupy a spot on the dark path. Mr. George saved one of our Church's punishers and should rightfully join our Church. Seeing Crest extend an invitation, Radar was not to be outdone and immediately extended an invitation as well. At this moment, his attitude became very friendly and gentle, no longer the condescending scrutiny he had shown at the beginning. The people of the Church of the Lord of Storms have bad tempers, but that depends on who they are dealing with. Mr. George resides within the jurisdiction of our Night Watchers, so joining our Church would be more appropriate for him, Creste retorted without backing down. Just because you're within the jurisdiction of your Night Watchers, you want to join you? That's laughable. Then why would someone who saved your punisher want to join you? That's even more ridiculous. Crest A, how dare you, a mere sequence 5, try to compete with me. Rilda, do you think I'm afraid of you just because you're sequence 4? The two high-ranking deacons, who had just been working together seamlessly, were now on the verge of fighting over the invitation for George to join the Church. Seeing this, George quickly waved his hand and laughed. You two don't need to be like this. My parents are actually followers of the Church of the God of Steam and Machinery. If anyone is going to join a church, it should be the Church of the God of Steam and Machinery. However, I'm still young and haven't thought about joining a church yet. I want to spend more time with my parents like a normal child. So, let's talk about joining a church when I'm an adult. Klein is a member of the Church of the Goddess of Night, and one of the members of Klein's Tarot Club is from the Church of the Lord of Storms. He already has intelligence sources from these two churches, so there's no need for him to join them. Moreover, joining a church requires faith in the true God, directly exposing oneself to the true God's gaze, which is not a good thing. But rest assured, both of you, whether it's the Church of the Goddess of Night or the Church of the Lord of Storms, if you need my help in anything, you can come to me. Saving the out-of-control individuals, capturing cultists, I'm willing to help. Then thank you very much, Mr. George. Hearing George's affirmative tone, Creste and Radar exchanged a glance and stopped arguing, nodding simultaneously. Continuing further and pushing George to the Church of the God of Steam and Machines, whose situation was still unclear, would be a huge loss. Since George had decided to wait until he came of age to choose a church to join, they would wait. They also needed to go back and report the latest intelligence about George to their superiors. Most importantly, George's strength was undeniable. They wouldn't dare to force him. If it were any low-sequence extraordinary individual, they wouldn't be able to do this. They would have to agree even if they didn't want to, otherwise they would spend their lives in the church's prison. Besides, George's attitude towards both churches was very friendly, and he was willing to help at any time, which could be considered as indirectly achieving their goal. However, my help comes at a price, George continued, seeing that the two had stopped arguing. If it's rescuing those who have gone out of control, it's £150 for sequence 9, £500 for sequence 8, £1,000 for sequence 7, £3,000 for sequence 6, £5,000 for sequence 5, £10,000 for sequence 4, and £30,000 for sequence 3. The same price applies if it's helping to deal with cultists. Or we can exchange it for equivalent materials needed for my sequence advancement. Also, I'm currently only sequence 7, so I can only help rescue those below sequence 7. To rescue those at higher sequences, I'll probably have to wait until my sequence advances. No problem. The two senior deacons nodded firmly again. They had never considered asking an expert like George for free. George's prices were incredibly low. Sometimes you couldn't find such an expert even for 3 or 4 times the price. Especially for rescuing those who have gone out of control, even 10 times the price is reasonable for important people. Besides, the church isn't short of money. Oh, and one more thing. My father is about to be promoted to a position in Backland, and I will be going there as well. If possible, could the church please help him out and make his job a little easier and less tiring? George made one last request. His purpose was twofold. Firstly, to inform both churches that he was going to Backland, to the church headquarters, which would create more opportunities for cooperation. Secondly, to demonstrate his humanity. The more someone values their parents and possesses extraordinary humanity, the more the church would trust them. Mr. Jack will receive a high-paying and easy position, Radar replied immediately. The church's influence in the kingdom was unparalleled. To put it bluntly, even the lone royal family had to obey some of the church's arrangements, otherwise, they wouldn't have become royalty. The kingdom of Lone worshipped the goddess of night and the lord of storms, and their influence was roughly equal. However, the lone royal family, the Augustus family, had always worshipped the lord of storms, so this small matter was insignificant. After everything was discussed, the two senior deacons returned to the church headquarters that night, and George also went home. However, upon returning home, he didn't immediately enter a meditative state. Instead, he went to the gray fog to explain the situation to Klein, giving him a general idea. The following evening, Klein again used the power of the gray fog to contact George, as he had recruited another new member. This time, however, the new member recruited into the gray fog wasn't from an ordinary city, but from the legendary Forsaken Land. Through this new member, Klein obtained a considerable amount of useful information, which he shared with George. The next 2 days were peaceful. George's convertible spiritual energy steadily increased, and he unlocked more spells that utilized spiritual energy and magician abilities. His parents had already sold one house, and after selling a second, they planned to set off for Backland. Monday afternoon, 3 o'clock. George attended Klein's first tarot gathering organized above the gray fog. Ahem, well, I might have to pretend a little later, otherwise I won't be able to fool them, Klein reminded George before officially starting to recruit people. To be honest, playing the fool in front of George, who knew the truth, required considerable mental preparation. Chapter 740 Mirror Sequence 5. Understood. I'll cooperate with whatever you need, George gave an okay sign. He thought Klein was quite clever. With only a sequence 9, he had managed to disguise himself as an ancient, resurrected god using the characteristics of the gray fog space, and hadn't been discovered yet. This wasn't something an ordinary person could do. It required extraordinary mental fortitude, superb acting skills and thick skin, as well as exceptional reaction speed. With George's approval, Klein sat back in his fool's seat, reached out and pressed a deep red star, first summoning the soul of the boy from the Forsaken Land from 2 days ago. Son, we meet again. After a brief exchange with the boy, he pressed 2 more deep red stars, and 2 blurry figures slowly appeared after a burst of light. Although their specific features were unclear, they were clearly a man and a woman. The man had long, dark blue hair, and his clothing style was reminiscent of island dwellers. The woman was slender, dressed in luxurious clothes, and possessed an elegant demeanor, clearly of noble birth. According to Klein's guess, the man codenamed the Hanged Man is most likely from the Church of the Lord of Storms, and his current strength should be that of a Sequence 7 navigator. The woman codenamed Justice is most likely a young lady from a noble family in Backland. She was initially an ordinary person who was pulled into the gray fog by him and traded with a Hanged Man for the audience potion formula. She has now advanced to a Sequence 9 audience. These two are new members, titled Power and Sun. This is Miss Justice, and this is Mr. the Hanged Man. Klein introduced him as the Fool. Justice and the Hanged Man seemed quite surprised by the new members. However, Justice's surprise quickly turned to joy, while the Hanged Man showed a slight hint of displeasure, but quickly regained his composure. After a brief greeting, the two sat in their respective seats and began observing George and the Sun. One seemed nervous and awkward, appearing quite young, while the other was very relaxed, seemingly more at ease than the two veteran members. Mr. Fool, I found 2 more pages of Emperor Roselle's diary, Miss Justice reported cheerfully to Klein. George knew that Klein was using the two of them to gather information about Roselle, a fellow countryman who had been released more than 200 years earlier than him, hoping to obtain relevant intelligence from Roselle's notes written in simplified Chinese. This was also his main source of information to maintain the Fool's pretentious image. After Klein finished reading Roselle's notes, it was time for the new and old members of the Tarot Society to freely exchange and trade. Miss Justice needed the potion recipe for the next stage of the mind reader from the audience, while the Sun needed the potion recipe for the 9th sequence of the Sun Path, the Singer. The Sun could provide the mind reader potion recipe, but Miss Justice didn't have the Singer potion recipe. So Klein would provide the Singer potion recipe, which he could use to pay off the 2 pages of notes he had just received from Miss Justice. The deal was done. George didn't interrupt the whole time, just watched with a smile, and gleaned useful information from their conversation. For example, the evil organization Aurora Society had extreme hatred for the Church of the Storm Lord, the Church of the Eternal Sun, and the Church of the God of Knowledge and Wisdom. The Aurora Society has 5 saints and 22 divine messengers, all designated by letters. The weakest are all sequence 7, and they are quite adept at concealing themselves. Each divine messenger who dies is quickly replaced by a new one. It wasn't until later, when the Hanged Man wanted to find and deal with Kalingas, one of the 7 pirate generals who had infiltrated Backland, that he finally spoke, asking, "What is the strength of this Hurricane General Kalingas, a sequence 6 wind-chosen one, but he has a magical item called the Creeping Hunger, which can mimic the abilities of other sequence beyonders, making him very difficult to deal with. Oh, then he's at most sequence 5. I'll be living in Backland in a couple of days, let me know if there's any news about him." George nodded, not paying much attention. He could easily kill several sequence 5s with a single slap. A sequence 4 demigod might be a bit more of a concern. At most sequence 5, hearing George's answer, the Hanged Man, Justice, and the Sun all showed expressions of shock. They hadn't expected this new member, who had remained silent, to be so powerful. Judging from his tone, sequence 5 seemed completely unconcerned. Could he already be sequence 4? Sequence 4 is a demigod-level existence, a true high-ranking member of the Church. Are the new members of the Tarot Society really that strong? One of the 2 new members might be from the legendary Forsaken Land, while the other's strength might have already reached sequence 4. Don't even mention sequence 5, even sequence 4 wouldn't be a match for him. He just defeated 2 high-ranking deacons of the Church with sequence 4 strength. Klein, sitting above playing the fool, couldn't help but sigh inwardly. Alright, no problem. What kind of reward do you need? The Hanged Man was overjoyed but also somewhat worried, fearing he couldn't afford the reward. George thought for a moment and said, "Help me collect more information from the previous eras and prehistoric times. You too. If you find anything, I'll reward you." He now wanted to learn more about the history of this world and find some clues about the original creator. After the exchange, the other 3 dispersed, while George stayed behind. "Is there any useful information in Roselle's notes? Take a look for yourself." Klein handed the 2 pages of notes to George, who glanced at them and raised an eyebrow. These 2 pages did indeed contain a considerable amount of useful information. Besides the decadent aristocratic life of Roselle and the various ladies, it also recorded that extraordinary individuals could switch to similar pathways after sequence 4. For example, the Sleepless Path and the Corpse Collector Path, the Sleuth and the Know-It-All Path, could all be switched at sequence 4. But they had to be similar pathways. If they switched randomly, they would basically go insane. Also, Roselle had joined an ancient organization that possessed a second profane tablet, which recorded 22 complete sequence paths. Roselle had even used that profane tablet to create a deck of cards containing the 22 sequence paths in his later years. However, the notes didn't specify where the deck of cards containing the 22 sequence paths was hidden. "By the way, how did you get the potion recipe for the Sun sequence?" George asked Klein after reading the 2 pages of notes. He remembered that during their last exchange, Klein was unaware of the Sun sequence, indicating he had clearly made new discoveries in the past few days. It's important to understand that the Sun sequence belongs to the Eternal Sun Church, one of the 7 great righteous churches, and obtaining the corresponding potion recipes is not easy. Churches are extremely guarded about the recipes for their own sequence pathways. Chapter 741 The Magical Pacifier. Klein didn't hide anything and explained carefully, I was just about to tell you that these past 2 days, the captain and I were on a mission and used a sealed artifact called 3-0782, a mutated sun emblem. It can continuously purify corpses and ghosts within a 15-meter radius, but it will dissipate in less than a minute. The downside is that it also purifies the souls of normal people. If a normal person stays within its 15-meter range for an hour, they will become an idiot who only knows how to praise the sun, and the limit for extraordinary individuals is 6 hours. That day, I was bored and tried to do some divination, but due to interference, I couldn't get any results. So I took it to the gray fog space to isolate the interference and do divination there, and that's when I saw the formation of the sun emblem, mainly from a drop of golden liquid. Afterwards, I divined the source of that golden liquid. You don't know, I felt like I saw the real sun at that moment, and I was almost burned to ashes on the spot. Thankfully the gray fog blocked 99% of the power. It was then that I obtained the potion recipes for the sun sequence from sequence 9 to sequence 4, as well as a technique for creating a sunfire spell. To be honest, I suspect that drop of golden blood might be divine blood, and that sun might be the eternal sun. That's interesting. George's eyes lit up after hearing Klein's explanation. Using the gray mist to block interference, one could actually divine the true form of a god, thus indirectly acquiring their knowledge. If he divined within Klein's gray mist, wouldn't he be able to completely exploit the eternal sun? Klein's strength was too weak to withstand the eternal sun's instinctive counterattack, but he wasn't afraid. Even without the gray mist blocking 99% of the attack, his soul strength wouldn't be injured by that slight burning. And it wasn't just the eternal sun, he could use this method to exploit anything related to righteous or evil gods, acquiring the corresponding knowledge. Is the 3-0782 seal still in your possession? The mission is over. The captain took it back and resealed it. Klein shook his head. George explained his idea, and Clay's eyes lit up. Perhaps I can ask Mr. Isaac for help. Isaac was his history teacher at his original school, and also a high-sequence powerhouse suspected of being a corpse collector. However, for some reason, he had lost his memories. He was currently helping him recover them. He could then ask Mr. Isaac to create a ghost event, which would allow him to propose using the sealed artifact 3-0782. He could also use the mutated sun emblem to create a sunfire charm as a trump card. Alright, no rush, George nodded. Klein had told him about Isaac. He planned to wait until he could convert forgetting spells and similar magic into spells suitable for this world before treating Isaac. Perhaps he could extract some useful information from his memories. Oh, by the way, here you go. George handed Klein a pacifier. Klein, somewhat bewildered, took the pacifier, blinking as he looked at the faint flame patterns appearing on it, clearly waiting for George's explanation. George smiled. This is a magical item I created using Taoist incantations from my past life combined with a magician's abilities. When you hold it in your mouth, you can unleash Samadhi fire, which can inflict extremely strong damage on enemies like the undead, and also burn the souls of living beings. Even a sequence 6 extraordinary would likely suffer greatly from such a burn. If you encounter someone stronger than sequence 6, then silently recite my name while holding it in your mouth. I can sense it and teleport here to help using the flames on the pacifier. He was about to go to Backland, and considering Klein's weak strength, a single sequence 8 might be enough to kill him. He felt it was best to have an extra layer of insurance before leaving. Fortunately, his research had yielded some results in the past 2 days, allowing him to forge a passable magical artifact. This way, Klein could handle those below sequence 6 himself, without needing his help. The probability of Klein encountering enemies of sequence 6 or higher is extremely low. If he does encounter one, he'll personally come to help. If he can't even get the pacifier out in time to call for help, then Klein is just too unlucky. He can't be by Klein's side every day. In that case, he can only wait until he can use more power, or until the sequence level of this world increases significantly, before he can retrieve the gray mist space. However, this pacifier is only temporary. Later, as his power recovers, he will create a more powerful magical artifact to save Klein's life. Samadhi True Fire. Klein looked at the pacifier in his hand, his eyes shining brightly, and he couldn't help but exclaim inwardly, "Fellow countrymen, your thigh is so thick, so fragrant." Just being able to damage a sequence 6 is already very powerful, but more importantly, it can summon George for help. George is a top expert who can overpower 2 high-level deacons with a strength of sequence 4. As long as he doesn't encounter an angel of sequence 3 or higher, with this pacifier, he basically doesn't have to worry about his life being threatened. What are the negative effects of this pacifier? There are no negative effects. As long as your spiritual energy isn't exhausted, you can keep using it to spew samadhi fire. George waved his hand. Almost all magical items in this world, except for talismans, have negative effects. The more powerful the magical item, the more terrifying the negative effects. Therefore, one must be extremely careful when using them, trying to avoid or reduce negative effects, or learning to use negative effects in reverse to achieve one's own goals. The church is very experienced in this regard. They do a very good job when using sealed artifacts. But this pacifier he made is different. He mainly used the crafting methods of other worlds, only adapting them to the power system of this world. Therefore, it has no negative effects. No negative effects at all. Klein's evaluation of the pacifier in his hand immediately rose several notches upon hearing this. For him, apart from the pacifier's shape and the slightly awkward need to hold it in his mouth, this magical item was perfect. However, he wasn't a shy person. A little awkwardness was better than death. Actually, he didn't know that George could craft this magical artifact from anything. However, when he had this idea, there happened to be a new pacifier his parents had bought nearby, and since he didn't want to use it, he just grabbed it and used it to refine the pacifier. He gave the pacifier to Klein, and George left the gray mist space to go home and continue his research. Klein, on the other hand, made a decision in his heart. I can't delay any longer. The potion has been fully digested. I should report to the captain and find a way to advance to sequence 8 as quickly as possible. George can help for a while, but he can't help forever. I still have to rely on myself. If you are listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means it was downloaded and re-uploaded without effort. We warmly invite you to visit our channel, Fanfic World. There you will find the original version of this story and many other novels of various genres. We look forward to seeing you dive into a world of incredible novels. Chapter 742 First Arrival in the capital Backlund. 2 days later, George and the Bartons, filled with hope and a bright future for the capital city, boarded the steam train to Backlund. It's no wonder the Bartons felt so optimistic. Just yesterday, the Backlund City Hall had sent a letter informing them of Jack's new position in Backlund, along with his job duties and compensation. Normally, Jack's transfer would be lateral, with the same position but better pay in the capital. However, the Backlund City Hall, recognizing Jack's excellent work performance, made an exception and promoted him a rank. This transformed Jack from an ordinary City Hall employee into a leader with considerable power, elevating his social status significantly. In modern terms, it was like going from an ordinary police officer to police station chief. His work would now consist of signing documents and attending meetings in the office, yet his salary had increased tenfold. Furthermore, the 2 houses they had sold had not only not depreciated but had even appreciated in value due to their good locations, giving them enough money to buy a house in Backlund. A lowly policeman from an ordinary county town suddenly being transferred to Beijing as the head of a police station, and even able to buy an apartment there, how could this not fill one with hope? Of course, all of this was because of George. After the 2 high-ranking deacons returned, the church's higher-ups personally contacted the royal family to issue a transfer order to the city hall. The steam-powered car traveled all the way from morning till night, finally arriving in Backlund. As the capital of the Kingdom of Rune, Backlund boasted a population of over 5 million and was recognized as the most prosperous city in both the northern and southern continents, far surpassing Tianjin City. Its only drawback was the poor air quality. Everywhere was shrouded in a pale yellow haze, severely limiting visibility. Snap! George, held in Chris's arms, secretly snapped his fingers, and suddenly, the crotch of a certain gentleman reaching into Jack's pocket caught fire. Passing through the crowded streets, the family arrived at the station exit. Jack, over here. Oh, Uncle Hyde, thank you for taking the time to pick us up. Haha, your father was my best friend. You even peed on my shoulders when you were little. Don't be so polite with your uncle. A well-dressed old man with meticulously groomed hair smiled and embraced Jack. George knew from his parents' conversation that this Hyde was Jack's father's former colleague at the Earl's mansion, and now the Earl's butler. Jack had wanted to invest and make money to transfer to Backlund, and he wanted to find Uncle Hyde. However, Jack's father had long since passed away, and although the connection remained, it wasn't as strong as before. Things couldn't be done without money. Hyde's current enthusiasm for Jack was partly due to their friendship, but more importantly, it was because of Jack's current position in the City Hall. Now he was helping Jack establish himself in Backland, and Jack could help him in the future if needed. If Jack were just an old friend seeking a way to make a living in Backland, he would help, but not with such enthusiasm. At most, they would have their son come and pick them up, and then find them some passable jobs. Riding in the carriage prepared by Hyde, the family arrived at the house Hyde had helped them rent in advance, settling in temporarily. Next, with Hyde's help, they would slowly buy a house befitting their status and hire a butler and several servants. With Jack's current income, even if buying a new house used up all their savings, they could still afford the wages of a butler and several servants. This would also be more in line with his current status. 5 days later, it was Wednesday again. With the help of Hyde, the Earl's butler who had lived in Backland for 50 years and had many connections, the Bartons successfully purchased a decent villa on Passfield Street in the North End. The villa had 2 floors, more than a dozen rooms, stables, servants' quarters, and a small garden. The furniture and utensils were relatively old, but still respectable. The villa was actually worth £30,000, which the Bartons, with their savings of just over £10,000, hadn't originally considered buying. Because to buy it, they would have to take out a bank loan. Jack's job loan was definitely secured, but the financial burden would be much heavier. Although his salary had increased tenfold, maintaining a respectable appearance required hiring a butler and servants, a significant expense. Raising children was another cost. Maintaining relationships with superiors, colleagues, and neighbors for future advancement also incurred expenses. Add to that a mortgage, and life would become quite tight. Just as the Bartons were about to give up and continue looking, the landlord, in a hurry to sell, suddenly lowered the price from £30,000 to £10,000. So the Bartons were incredibly lucky to acquire this decent house. Only George knew that it wasn't a matter of the landlord being in a hurry to sell. The Church of the Night Goddess had definitely intervened. The villa at 9 Passfield Street was less than 100 meters from St. Samuel's Cathedral, the headquarters of the Church of the Night Goddess. Reducing the price by £20,000 for the Bartons was a gesture of goodwill. However, placing the house so close to the church clearly indicated that the church was still wary of him and wanted to monitor him. It could also have been an attempt to win him over. In the morning, a servant drove Jack to work at the City Hall in a carriage. Because Jack's promotion was directly ordered by the royal family, the City Hall officials believed he had connections and were quite friendly to this newcomer transferred from the small town. Jack's work went very smoothly, and he was in high spirits every day. Chris, on the other hand, spent his time showing George around the capital, building relationships with his neighbors, and preparing for his first banquet in the capital, leading a very fulfilling life. George continued his research as usual, and incidentally helped the Church of the Goddess of Night and the Church of the Lord of Storms each rescue 2 low-sequence out-of-control individuals. At 3 p.m., the tarot meeting began as usual. Miss Justice obtained the formula for the mind-reading potion from the sun, and the hangman had more detailed information about Zalingus. Zalingus infiltrated Backland on a mission to lie in wait for a period of time and commit a horrific tragedy. After completing the mission, he would receive an item that could quickly advance him to a high-sequence powerhouse. At the same time, the hangman also described many details of Zalingus's life and personality habits, clearly knowing Zalingus very well. After some discussion, it was decided that Miss Justice would be in charge of finding Zalingus's whereabouts and, once found, immediately informing George to eliminate him. After the tarot meeting, George read through the pages of Roselle's diary that Klein had, gaining some more useful information. Chapter 743, The Start of Wool Plucking. How is the mutated sun emblem coming along? George asked Klein after reading Roselle's diary. Using the sun emblem's elixir of eternal heat through divination was currently the fastest and safest way to acquire a large amount of advanced knowledge. Klein held up 2 fingers, almost done. If all goes well, I'll have another chance to apply for the mutated sun emblem in 2 days. He had already commissioned Mr. Isaac to create a ghost incident, and if nothing went wrong, he could find an opportunity to apply for the mutated sun emblem in 2 days. In fact, nothing went wrong. 2 days later, in the afternoon, while dealing with a ghost incident with his 2 teammates, Klein took a moment to bring the mutated sun emblem into the gray fog space and summon George again. The power contained within is indeed considerable. George took the mutated sun emblem, feeling the purifying power of the sun and the power of the mind emanating from it, and silently nodded. The power contained in this mutated sun emblem was not much lower than that of a regular sequence 4. The power within the body of that high-ranking deacon of the Storm Lord last time was roughly the same level. The source of this item's power, unlike Klein, who first divined the source of the mutated sun emblem and then the source of the golden liquid that constituted its power, he directly divined its essence. If the power of this mutated sun emblem truly came from the eternal sun, then he could directly connect to the eternal sun's true form. Holding the mutated sun emblem, George entered a meditative state. At that moment, a dazzling golden sun appeared in his inner world the instant he entered meditation. With the appearance of the sun, various knowledge related to the sun's sequence flooded into his mind. HMPH, just as he obtained the potion recipe for sequence 4 darkness free, a cold snort came from the sun. Immediately afterwards, the power of the sun god, weakened through layers of gray mist, burned towards George. Compared to Klein's previous near-death experience from the burning, George showed no reaction to the weakened power of the sun god. He continued the divination ritual, extracting the corresponding knowledge from the sun. The potion recipes for Sequence 3 Justice Mentor, Sequence 2 Light Chaser, and Sequence 1 Pure White Angel, along with the abilities of various sequences, flooded into his mind. Unfortunately, just as he was about to obtain the potion formula and related abilities of the Sequence 0 Sun, the divination was forcibly interrupted. The golden sun instantly transformed into a handsome, sunny, and energetic young man in a pure white robe with short, fiery golden hair. The young man, holding a book in one hand and a golden orb in the other, glared angrily at George. "How dare you spy on this god? Accept divine punishment." A power 100 times more terrifying than before erupted from the young man's body, rushing towards George along a sliver of connection. A few days ago, a daring diviner, a sequence extraordinary, dared to spy on him, only to be wiped out by a sliver of power emanating from his instinctive counterattack. These past 2 days, another one had unexpectedly appeared. He had assumed this one would also be easily eliminated, but unexpectedly, the divination didn't stop after he launched his attack. This indicated that the opponent was not weak and had withstood his instinctive counterattack. How could he let such a daring offender go unpunished? He immediately mobilized more power, spreading along the divination trail. Unless the opponent is Sequence 0, being struck by this attack is certain death. With a temper, feeling the burning sensation 100 times stronger than before, George reached out and wiped away the flames, temporarily stopping his divination. If you were outside the gray fog, being struck by the eternal sun like this, without using his energy, relying solely on his physical body and soul to withstand it would be quite dangerous. But inside the gray fog, his power was weakened by 99%, so naturally there was no threat. However, it was only him, let alone Klein, even those at Sequence 2 or 3, if struck seriously by the eternal flame weakened by 99% inside the gray fog, would undoubtedly die. If he continued, he could actually glean some knowledge. But he decisively gave up. Because the eternal sun had clearly noticed this place, if he continued to probe after this attack, the eternal sun would know he wasn't dead. At that point, it might even descend from its divine kingdom to see what was going on. If the eternal sun were to descend upon Tingen, it would most likely discover the existence of the gray mist space. Even if it couldn't descend in its true form, sending a Sequence 2 angel would still cause considerable trouble. "George, are you alright?" Seeing George open his eyes, Klein breathed a long sigh of relief. The flames that had just erupted from George's body had burned his soul even while hiding in a corner of the gray mist. One could imagine how terrifying the eternal sun's counterattack would be. "I'm fine." It's a pity he reacted quickly, otherwise he could have obtained the potion recipe for Sequence 0 of the sun sequence. George smiled and waved his hand, recounting to Klein the potion recipes and related knowledge he had acquired for Sequences 3, 2, and 1 of the sun sequence. It was only because the eternal sun was a righteous god that he had divined for an evil god, otherwise, he would have squeezed every last drop of profit from it. Evil gods could only inflict damage through divination, but they couldn't descend in their true form. As long as they could withstand the damage, they could be exploited however they pleased. "It's almost time, I need to go back, or my teammates will find out." Klein noted down George's description of the high sequence potion recipes, rituals, and various abilities and information about the various rituals related to the solar path, and then ended the meeting. George, whose soul had returned to his body, began researching how to convert similar magic using the occult knowledge about the sun he had just acquired from the eternal sun. For example, the various light magics of fairy tale and the super magic fairy glow, as well as the light cards of clow cards. With a corresponding knowledge of this world's power system as support, he could more quickly research and convert magic based on similar laws from other worlds. Just like how he had previously gained the fire abilities of a magician and thus knew the related knowledge, he could easily convert various fire magics. If he could obtain the occult knowledge related to the tyrant path, then he could also quickly research and convert spells related to lightning, wind, and water. However, it didn't matter if he didn't have that knowledge. It just meant the conversion wouldn't be as fast, and it would take more time. Once the sealing technique is completed and the fetus inside Mageo's body is sealed, I estimate we can use that fetus to divination and glean a lot of useful occult knowledge. Whatever he thought of, it appeared. A week later, George actually had a chance to come into contact with the evil god and fleece him. However, it wasn't through the fetus inside Mageo's body, but through old Neil, the night watchman who had some mental issues last time. Chapter 744 Old Neil and the Hidden Sage. Old Neil's gone out of control. George received the news from Klein within the gray fog space. Klein's expression was somewhat distressed. When old Neil was young, he had a girlfriend named Celeste, with whom he was about to get engaged. However, she suddenly fell seriously ill and was incurable. He risked revealing the secrets of the extraordinary to try and save her with ritual magic, but he still failed. Now, influenced and bewitched by the hidden sage, he wants to resurrect Celeste through life transmutation, and has ultimately gone out of control, becoming a monster. The captain and I temporarily controlled him using a sealing artifact and imprisoned him in the basement of the Night Watch base. He's quite the devoted lover, George sighed. Don't worry, as long as he's not dead, I can restore him. In his view, whether it's family, friendship, or love, it will gradually fade with time. Someone who can still remember their loved one after decades is indeed quite devoted. That's good. Klein breathed a sigh of relief upon hearing this. Old Neil was his closest colleague among the Night Watchers, having taught him a lot about occultism, making him almost like a mentor. So he genuinely didn't want anything to happen to old Neil. The captain has already sent a telegram to the sanctuary. They should be contacting you soon. Okay, keep old Neil under control. I should be there first thing tomorrow morning. George nodded and then left the gray mist space. Sure enough, not long after, someone from the church arrived. It was an old acquaintance, none other than Crest Sesima, the high-ranking deacon with the title Sword of the Goddess who had gone to Tingen last time. It was normal. The church was less than 100 meters from his house, a short walk after receiving the telegram. Crest was sent because he was quite familiar with George. It was Crest who had come to him last time to restore a runaway night watcher in Constance. You succeeded in the advancement. George noticed the significant increase in Crest's spiritual energy and got up from his crib to ask. When they returned from Constance, Crest had mentioned that he planned to take a potion to advance to Sequence 4. I succeeded. Crest smiled and nodded. George chuckled. Congratulations. What brings you here? Old Neil, the night watchman of Tingen, has lost control and wants you to come with me. Crest quickly explained his purpose. Old Neil, huh? No wonder I thought he had some mental issues before. I didn't expect him to actually lose control. George feigned belated realization. The two then quickly left, taking a carriage to the station. As for home, with the church's night watchman's abilities, fooling his parents for a day or two would be too easy. His parents wouldn't even notice he was missing. On the steam train, in a private compartment, George was chatting with Crest. As one of the church's 9 deacons, Crest naturally knew a lot of secret information and a great deal of occult knowledge. Every time he chatted with him, he gained a lot. On the train to and from Constance last time, he had extracted a lot of useful information. Old Neil seems to be on the Seeker's path. It's said that extraordinary individuals on this path are prone to losing control. That's not wrong, because extraordinary individuals on the Seeker's path are pursued by knowledge and forcibly instilled with it. Crest nodded. Pursued by knowledge? George looked puzzled. Crest explained, the Seeker path, or more precisely, the Hermit path, originally belonged to an ancient 4th century organization called the Ascetic Order of Moth. They worshipped an impersonal deity called the Hidden Sage. The early Ascetic Order of Moth was a highly respected organization, with good relations with us, and one of the few organizations recognized by the church as extraordinary. Members used asceticism to combat loss of control, counteract the effects of residual potions, and strictly adhere to secrecy, morality, and precepts. They believed in reincarnation after death, upholding morality and precepts, persisting in the pursuit of knowledge, and strictly maintaining secrecy. All members, upon becoming seekers, were required to remain silent for 5 years, learning to meditate in order to cultivate and improve concentration. Their motto was, "Do as you please, but do not harm." Their members believed in the number of all things and pursued knowledge itself. However, one day, their hidden sage was corrupted by an evil god. Becoming a personified evil god, he began to pursue every member of the Morse ascetic order, every extraordinary individual on the hermit path, forcibly instilling vast amounts of occult knowledge into their minds. They either had to endure it through sheer willpower, or they would be transformed by the hidden sage, ultimately spiraling out of control and becoming monsters. He revealed this partly so that George could better treat the out-of-control Night Watchers after understanding these things, and partly as a return for George's kindness. George only charged £150 for treating the church's Night Watchers and would even proactively return the extracted extraordinary traits, which was quite generous. Therefore, he was willing to tutor this powerful but clueless young man about the realm of extraordinary individuals during casual conversation. Knowledge follows people? Is that even possible? George's eyes lit up immediately upon hearing this. For a normal extraordinary individual, the forced instilling of knowledge from a god would undoubtedly be extremely painful, but for him, this was not a problem at all. If he had known earlier, he would have chosen the hermit path, and wouldn't he have been able to completely drain the hidden sage? However, it's possible now. Once Old Neil's extraordinary characteristics are analyzed, they can use the extraordinary characteristics of Old Neil being influenced by the hidden sage to divine the hidden sage. Although this won't completely drain the hidden sage, it should still yield a considerable amount of occult knowledge. The more occult knowledge he acquires, the faster he can convert magic from other worlds. The next morning, the two arrived at the Blackthorn Security Company in Tenjin City, which is the headquarters of the Tenjin City Night Watchers. After being received by Night Watcher Captain Dunn, the two went to the basement room where Old Neil was being held. At this time, Old Neil had turned into disgusting, viscous, blood-red liquid covered with dense black short hairs. His gray head was connected to the liquid, and a pair of eyes grew from his forehead and cheeks, cold, eyelashless eyes. We used the 3-0611 sealing artifact on Old Neil. Dunn looked at Old Neil now, his eyes filled with sorrow. Old Neil was currently the teammate he had spent the longest time with in the Night Watcher team. The others had all died or gone out of control during missions over the years. It's fortunate that George was there, otherwise he would have lost his teammate who was like family again. They, the Night Watchers, are guardians, but also a group of pitiful creatures constantly fighting against danger and madness. Chapter 745, A Bountiful Harvest of Mysterious Knowledge. The 3-0611 seal is the Tranquil Hair, Crusade suddenly realized. He remembered this seal. It was formed from the extraordinary characteristics of a former colleague of his, a Sequence 6, which had attached themselves to his hair after death. Most seals are actually products of extraordinary characteristics extracted after death and combined with something else, and their effects are related to the extraordinary's abilities. His colleague was a necromancer in life, so the extraordinary ability of the Tranquil Hair was to make the person who came into contact with it lose all desires and emotions, and remain quietly in place. It could affect Sequence 5 at most. The negative effect was that it had to be removed every 2 hours, otherwise, the person would permanently lose all desires and emotions and become quiet. You all go out, leave it to me. George dismissed everyone from the room where Old Neil was being held, saying he didn't like having people watching him while he was working. After everyone left, he began to quickly treat Old Neil, extracting the extraordinary characteristics from his body that had been corrupted by the hidden sage. Because he had converted a lot more spiritual energy during this time, he completed the operation in less than 3 seconds. As his extraordinary abilities were released and his soul was purified, Old Neil returned from a monster to a normal old man. However, due to the influence of his quiet hair, he was not yet fully awake. Taking advantage of this time, George began to divine Old Neil's extraordinary abilities. This time, he did not enter Klein's gray mist for divination. Because the gray mist isolated most of the hidden sage's power, it was equivalent to isolating most of the infusion of mystical knowledge. The source of Old Neil's corruption, closing his eyes and entering a meditative state, a special light immediately appeared in George's mind. That light seemed to be composed of countless streams of complex information, moving like a torrent in an illusory form. It was the embodiment of the mystical knowledge of this world, the corrupted hidden sage after being personified. Upon sensing George's divination, the torrent of light immediately followed the divination lines and crashed into George's mind. Countless mystical knowledge exploded in George's mind like dynamite. If this were an ordinary low-sequence extraordinary being, they would probably lose control and become a monster immediately because they could not withstand this knowledge. Even high-ranking powerhouses would find it difficult to withstand this for long. Because George was now essentially looking directly at a god, directly at a hidden sage. This was far more terrifying than the periodic pursuit of knowledge by ordinary extraordinary individuals on the hermit path. However, this was exactly what George wanted. Facing the onslaught of the hidden sage's knowledge, George held firm to his soul, completely unaffected, and began to absorb and memorize this mystical knowledge with insatiable hunger. Even without merging, his avatar soul was far stronger than the hidden sage, completely unconcerned about the impact of this divination-based tracking. Come on, let the storm rage even more fiercely. George remained silent, simply accepting the pursuit of knowledge. Spiritual body, astral body, ethereal body, mental body, spirituality, inspiration, spiritual vision, the spirit world, the universe, ritual magic. Summoning messengers, ancient Hermesian language, ancient Frisian language, elven language, giant language, dragon language, countless mystical knowledge was absorbed and recorded by George. If this continued, he could completely absorb all the mystical knowledge of the hidden sage. Unfortunately, since the hidden sage possessed a personality, it must also have corresponding intelligence. While it might not have noticed immediately, the anomaly would inevitably be detected. Sure enough, after continuously infusing over 10 units of knowledge and finding no resistance, completely accepting it without incident, it immediately withdrew the torrent of knowledge. Moreover, no matter how George provoked it or tried to divine, it refused to transmit any more knowledge. It even used its mystical knowledge to forcibly block George's divination. Forget it, once I'm strong enough, I'll find this guy and devour him completely. That should allow me to acquire all the mystical knowledge of this world. For a being like the hidden sage, a kind of evil god, killing and devouring it was no burden for him. If you mentioned the 7 righteous gods, he might hesitate. At least these righteous gods, while aiming to develop followers as anchors, did maintain the stability of the world, preventing ordinary people from being killed by evil gods. Right, even becoming a righteous god carries the risk of losing control. That's why a large number of followers are needed as anchors to maintain rationality, preventing one from becoming a chaotic and irrational mythical monster. This knowledge came from the hidden sage. Unfortunately, if the hidden sage hadn't reacted quickly, he could have immediately gained even more knowledge about the true gods, and perhaps even some information about the original creator. Even so, it was a great harvest for him. Having thoroughly studied all this occult knowledge, he could now cast magic from many other worlds. Reaching out, he removed the strand of quiet hair from old Neil, ignoring its effect, and led the bewildered old Neil outside the room. All done, Klein. Leonard, I'm sorry to have worried you. Old Neil, now fully awake, looked at the group with reddened eyes and said with some self-reproach. It's good that you're alive, it's good that you're alive. Captain Dunn stepped forward and gave old Neil a big hug. Klein breathed a sigh of relief, and Leonard, standing beside him, even joked, we spent £150 to save you. You'd better work hard to pay it back. Even without his extraordinary abilities, old Neil could still become a clerk among the Night Watchers, using his experience and knowledge to train new recruits. This guy is definitely a bit strange. George's gaze swept over Leonard, the handsome Night Watcher team member with a poet-like air, and he noticed something unusual. Leonard was one of the Night Watchers, Klein's colleague, and a dark sequence 8 midnight poet. Klein had mentioned to him that on the night of the battle in the warehouse, he seemed to have noticed something different about Leonard, but hadn't exposed it. Because he himself had also had a fortuitous encounter and considered himself the protagonist of the era. He hadn't noticed anything when he first met him, until just now when he brought old Neil out and vaguely sensed a probing sensation. Only then did he discover that Leonard seemed to have a second soul hidden within him. This soul was very good at hiding. If it hadn't been for his curiosity about his recovery from being out of control and probing, he really wouldn't have discovered it without using his mental power. This is somewhat like parasitism. If it is parasitism, how can it be hidden so well? Based on the knowledge he had just obtained from the hidden sage, he roughly guessed the other party's sequence path and strength. Chapter 746. Could it be that I really have someone above me? Of the 22 sequences, only the thief's path seems to possess the ability to parasitize. When a thief reaches sequence 4 parasite, they can parasitize the bodies of lower sequence beyonders to hide and heal injuries. But to dare parasitize a church beyonder without even crest A, who has advanced to sequence 4, being detected suggests their strength is at least sequence 3. Most likely, sequence 2 or 1. This is why he didn't immediately expose them. It wasn't that he was afraid of being outmatched, but rather that he felt the other party still had value and there was no need to immediately turn against them. He didn't yet know the other party's specific situation. If they were the type he could cooperate with, he might be able to extract a lot of useful information. The church was still wary of him and wouldn't tell him much crucial information. After restoring old Neil, George and Creste didn't immediately leave Tingen to return to Backlund. Creste had another matter to attend to in Tingen, to assess whether Klein had fully digested sequence 9 and to give the potion for advancing to sequence 8, the Joker. Klein had always assumed the church only possessed potion recipes and potions for the Night Goddess sequence, but in reality, the Church of the Night Goddess also had a special collection of potions and potion recipes for 2 other sequences, the Corpse Collector sequence and the Diviner sequence. Many skilled corpse collectors at sequence 6 and sequence 5 were among the church's middle ranks. While those in the Diviner sequence were currently at a lower sequence, the church likely possessed the means to obtain potions for higher sequences. Furthermore, they were raising mermaids, essential for a diviner to advance to sequence 5. These legendary creatures, besides being raised by the Church of the Night Goddess, could only be found in the dangerous deep sea. This was all revealed intentionally or unintentionally by Crest during his conversation with George. George understood Crest's intentions. He simply wanted to entice him to join the church. However, George didn't react. In George's view, the dangerous deep sea was only dangerous for ordinary extraordinary individuals. It posed no danger to him. As for the diviner's high-sequence potion recipes, he could obtain them through other means. He didn't want to join any church unless absolutely necessary, so that the church's true god could always focus his attention on him. After Klein's assessment ended, Creste and George returned to Backlund by car. Regarding the potion for the next sequence seer you requested, we have 2 conditions. First, assist the church in killing enemies of the corresponding sequence. Second, help the church rescue the out-of-control Night Watchers. Before George returned home, Creste informed him of the church's decision regarding whether to grant him the potion for the next sequence seer. After several tests, they had discovered that George was unlikely to join the church in the short term. However, because George had repeatedly helped the church rescue out-of-control individuals and held great goodwill towards the church, they didn't want George to be disappointed. Therefore, they decided to grant George's request for the next sequence seer potion, but not with money. He had to help the church with tasks. For example, if George needed the potion for the sequence 6 faceless men, then he would help the church kill 1 sequence 6 cultist, or kill 5 sequence 7 cultists, 10 sequence 8 cultists, and 20 sequence 9 cultists. Similarly, it could be used to save out-of-control individuals like Old Neo. 20 sequence 9s, 10 sequence 8s, 5 sequence 7s, and 1 sequence 6 are all equivalent. George is currently a sequence 7 and cannot save a sequence 6, but if an out-of-control sequence 6 does appear, they will first provide George with a sequence 6 potion to help him advance before saving him. The result will be the same. No problem, George didn't find the conditions offered by the Church of the Night Goddess difficult. Because it was obviously not a difficult task for him. Whether it was killing a sequence 6 or saving some out-of-control individuals, it was only a matter of time. He needed time to digest most of the occult knowledge he had just acquired, so there was no rush. If he didn't encounter a suitable opportunity in a short time after he had fully digested the knowledge, he could create one himself. Backlund was the capital of Lone, and it was home to a large number of cultists. The Mr. A that Miss Justice mentioned last time might be a cultist of the Aurora Society. He could ask Miss Justice for the location of Mr. A's extraordinary gathering and then take the initiative to capture him. And then there's that island general, Killingus, who's also infiltrated Backlund. Once Miss Justice has news, we can go and kill him to get the potion. He currently prefers problems that can be solved directly with force. Problems that can be solved with force aren't problems for him. Another week has passed, and the tarot meeting was held as usual on Wednesday afternoon. This time, the main topic of discussion was Kalingas. The extraordinary hired by Miss Justice discovered Kalingas's whereabouts, but was discovered by him, nearly killed, and ultimately lost the trail again. On Sunday, a grand ball was held at Duke Negan's mansion in the Queen's district of Backlund. The Barton family was fortunate enough to be invited to the ball. Oh, God of Steam, I never expected to be invited by His Excellency the Duke. Inside the carriage, Chris kept checking his makeup in the mirror, afraid of losing face at the ball. Sitting across from her, Jack was also a little nervous. Yeah, I didn't expect to receive an invitation either, although his position at the City Hall was decent. That was only compared to ordinary people. Compared to Duke Negan, it was like heaven and earth. One was a local police station chief, the other was the Minister of Defense, a difference of countless ranks. Even his direct superior hadn't received an invitation to the Duke's ball. Could it be that I really have connections, but I didn't even know it myself? Jack couldn't help but complain inwardly. He wasn't stupid. During his time at work, he had noticed something was amiss. Even if his colleagues at the City Hall were all very kind, it was unlikely that his direct superior would be so attentive to him every day, let alone receive an invitation from the Duke. Moreover, he had occasionally overheard colleagues discussing him privately, saying he had powerful connections, and some even said he was the illegitimate son of a member of the royal family. He hadn't believed it at first, but now he was starting to have doubts. However, he didn't think he was the illegitimate son of any royal family, because he looked almost exactly like his deceased father. He now suspects that his deceased father might have been the illegitimate son of a member of the royal family or a high-ranking nobleman. Chapter 747 Duke Negan's Banquet. At this moment, George, held in the arms of a maid, had some guesses about why his parents had been invited by the Duke. He guessed that it was because two high-ranking church officials had directly sought employment from the royal family, which alarmed Duke Negan, leading the Duke to believe that Jack might have significant connections with both churches. That's why a minor city official's name was added to the ball's guest list. We've arrived. The carriage gradually stopped at the entrance of the luxurious Duke's mansion. Led by the Duke's servants, the Barton family entered the mansion's hall. The gap between rich and poor is truly enormous. George opened his eyes and looked around at the decorations of the Duke's mansion, unable to help but sigh inwardly. In fact, he had taken some time to stroll around Backlund these past few nights. Backlund was known as the most prosperous city in the world, but in reality, most of the lower classes lived like pigs and dogs. The rich districts were filled with revelry every day, while many starved to death on the streets of the poor districts. A single cup in Duke Negan's mansion was enough for hundreds of people in the poor districts to work day and night for months. However, he wasn't particularly surprised. After all, even in his previous life's modern society, which was already very advanced in all aspects, there was still a huge gap between rich and poor. Ordinary people at the bottom of society simply cannot imagine the kind of life those rich people live, or the kind of life they enjoy. Madam, you can leave the child in our care. You just need to enjoy the ball to your heart's content. As soon as they entered the hall, a middle-aged maid with an extraordinary air took George from Chris and led him to a special room reserved for childcare. Actually, the maid was somewhat surprised to see Chris and Jack. Normally, families allowed to bring their children to the ball were mostly high-ranking nobles and officials. Lesser nobles and mid-level officials were generally only allowed to attend themselves, or at most, with their partners. However, Chris and Jack, judging from their attire and appearance, didn't seem like high-ranking nobles or officials, and she didn't recognize them. But the butler had just specifically instructed her to treat them well and take good care of their child. Just as the maid took George, a plump figure walked through the chorus of compliments. He was none other than the host of the banquet, the largest landed noble besides the king, the leader of the Conservative Party, and the elder brother of the current Prime Minister, Duke Negan. Jack Barton, are you settling into your new position? Is there anything you're unhappy about? Yes, everything's great, nothing's wrong, Jack, flustered that Duke Negan had personally come to greet him, almost stammered. Thank you for the promotion, Your Grace, he quickly replied, then realized something and thanked Duke Negan again. Duke Negan's question had made him vaguely aware that his preferential treatment at the City Hall seemed related to the Duke. So he had probed a little. Duke Negan smiled and nodded, praising Jack's comprehension. Keep up the good work, the kingdom needs talent like you. Indeed, Jack's promotion and current preferential treatment were somewhat related to him. The Archbishop of the Church of the Storm Lord and the Archbishop of the Dark Church had both approached the royal family and him, asking them to give this junior employee transferred from Tingen special consideration. The fact that two archbishops could do this simultaneously indicated that Jack's identity was certainly not simple. However, after some investigation, he found that this guy was nothing special at all. Both their background and occupation were utterly ordinary. The only noteworthy thing was that their father had worked for the Hall family, but that was hardly worth mentioning. That's why he had specifically written an extra invitation when hosting the banquet, wanting to meet them in person. However, he still didn't notice anything different. So he said a few words and didn't pay any more attention to it. But this was different in the eyes of the other nobles, especially the middle-ranking nobles and officials. To be valued so highly by Duke Negan meant that their future was undoubtedly bright and limitless. Originally, with Jack's status, even if he had the honor of attending a banquet of this level, he would probably be an insignificant, unnoticed nobody. But now, because of Duke Negan, the couple instantly became the focus of the middle-ranking nobles and officials, who all came to befriend them. George, being held by the maid, nodded secretly at the sight. It has to be said that at least the two churches had done a good job in this regard, which made him feel quite good about them. Although he didn't have any feelings for Jack and his wife, they were, after all, the biological parents of this body, and he still hoped that they could live a better life. When he no longer needed this identity, he would extract genes and souls from the two individuals to create a new child to replace him. Hey, is that Miss Justice? As George was carried by a maid to the designated nursery, a beautiful young woman descending the white marble staircase caught his attention. This girl had blonde hair and blue eyes, exceptional beauty, and a pure and elegant demeanor. Even in the most elite aristocratic circle, she stood out like a shining pearl. George immediately recognized her as Miss Justice, the 9th rank of the Tarot Society. Although the gray mist concealed her appearance, it couldn't hide her soul aura. He had long memorized the soul auras of Justice, the Hanged Man, and the Sun. Therefore, he could recognize her immediately upon encountering her. As expected, she's the daughter of a high-ranking nobleman from the Kingdom of Rune. George listened intently for a while and already knew Miss Justice's identity in reality. Audrey Hall, daughter of Earl Hall, a nobleman from Backland, was known as Backland's most dazzling jewel. Earl Hall was a truly powerful nobleman in the kingdom, possessing immense wealth and status. Incidentally, his identity was somewhat connected to Audrey. His grandfather had worked for the Hall family, and his father's closest relative in Backland, Uncle Hyde, was also one of the Hall family's butlers. Arriving at the nursery, George continued his research with his eyes closed. Having acquired a vast amount of occult knowledge, he was just one step away from mastering the sealing magic. Once he mastered the sealing technique, he could return to Tingen to seal the evil god fetus in his older cousin's womb, and then conveniently use the fetus to absorb some of the evil god's knowledge. However, just as he was engrossed in his research, he suddenly received a message from Klein via the gray mist. At the ball held by Duke Negan, I encountered someone resembling Zalingus. He was disguised as Baron Gramir, his motives unknown. I noticed from some details that Baron Gramir today was different from usual, which reminded me of the extraordinary ability of Zalingus's magical item to change appearances. Chapter 748 Slapped to Death. In the scene, Audrey, dressed in a courtly gown, was attending a banquet and praying to Klein, the fool. Tell her not to worry, I'm at the banquet, ready to take the pirate general's life at any time. After replying, George stopped focusing on his research and silently cast a spell. Eye of Insight. This was a spell he had recently acquired from Fairy Tales Irene. A phantom eye silently appeared above the entire Duke's mansion, taking in everything that happened within. If this Kalingus intended to commit violence in the Duke's mansion, he could kill him and exchange him for the potion to advance to Faceless One at the Church of the Night. Meanwhile, in the small prayer room of the Duke's mansion, Audrey received George's reply from Klein and couldn't help but show a surprised expression. Mr. Power is at the banquet. As an observer, she had been carefully observing every guest since the beginning of the banquet. This was her method of processing potions at this stage. It was precisely because of her meticulous observation that she discovered Kalingus, disguised as Baron Gramir. However, upon recalling all the guests at the banquet, none matched the characteristics of Mr. Power. About 10 minutes later, a sudden gust of wind swept into the Duke's hall, instantly extinguishing the candles on the crystal chandelier. The hall was plunged into darkness. Before anyone could react, the sound of crystal shattering on the ground rang out, and many nearby guests screamed from cuts caused by the crystal shards. These screams caused panic among the bewildered guests, who began to scatter in all directions. At this moment, a figure took advantage of the chaos to launch a deadly attack on Duke Negan. So the target was Duke Negan. George watched the assassination attempt while keeping an eye on his parents to prevent them from being injured in the darkness. Zalingus had created chaos to assassinate Duke Negan, but Duke Negan was no ordinary person. He was a powerful extraordinary, a Sequence 6 judge with a judgment path. Moreover, he was protected by extraordinary members of the Church of the Storm Lord, and had been well prepared thanks to Earl Hall's warning. Therefore, even with a powerful sealed artifact allowing him to wield near Sequence 5 strength, he quickly found himself at a disadvantage and was forced to retreat. Unfortunately, George, who had witnessed everything, was already positioned along his retreat route, quietly waiting for him to come and die. The Rune royal family isn't simple either. Having watched the entire attack and waiting for Zalingus to crash into him, George recalled the information Creste had given him about the Rune royal family and sighed inwardly. The Augustus family of the Rune royal family, possessing the judgment pathway, is one of the angelic families that existed since the Age of Gods. Later, with the support of the Seven Gods, they established a kingdom of Rune. The family's higher-ranking members are mostly extraordinary beings, and it seems they are also protected by true experts of Sequence 1 and Sequence 2. Here it comes. Zalingus smashed through the window and, using the gliding ability of a wind-chosen one, flew straight towards the Duke's mansion. If you were to fly out of the mansion, use the sealing artifact to change his appearance, and blend into the crowd, it would be impossible to find him again. However, just as he was about to fly out of the mansion, he suddenly saw an infant appear before him. An infant. He was stunned by this unbelievable scene. But he quickly realized that he was running for his life, and anyone who stood in his way would die, even an infant. Besides, an infant that could hover in the air was clearly not a normal infant. Windblade, a green windblade, powerful enough to cut through steel, flew from his hand, about to cleave the infant in his path in two. However, facing the windblade, George simply blew a breath, and the windblade vanished. What? Zalingus's pupils contracted, his eyes showing disbelief. Even a Sequence 5 couldn't so easily neutralize his windblade. How had he been exposed? Why did a mere duke of a kingdom have so many powerful protectors? Damn it! Secretly regretting accepting this mission so easily, he immediately activated one of his sealed abilities. Sleep. The sealed artifact in his hand was called Crawling Hunger, a sealed artifact created by combining the extraordinary characteristics of a Sequence 5 shepherd with a glove after his death. Crawling Hunger could shepherd the souls of up to 5 extraordinary beings, randomly drawing one extraordinary ability from each of those souls for him to use. It was through this sealed artifact that he was able to be called the omnipotent pirate general by the pirates at sea. However, the negative effect of this sealed artifact was also terrible. That is, it must be fed the flesh and soul of one person every day, otherwise it will devour its master. Currently, the 5 extraordinary beings he is hurting with a writhing hunger are Sequence 6 Faceless Man, Sequence 7 Psychiatrist, Sequence 7 Interrogator, Sequence 7 Nightmare, and Sequence 5 Light Priest. The extracted abilities are the ability to change appearance, to use psychological suggestion to simulate dragon might, to be proficient in various weapons and mental piercing, to silently drag into dreams, and to evolve necromancy to summon holy light. He was just using the ability of the Dark Sequence 7 Nightmare to drag the strange baby opposite him into a dream in order to escape the Duke's mansion. Unfortunately, he did not know that the Nightmare's ability to enter dreams was completely useless against George. Not to mention the Sequence 7 soul he was herding with a sealed artifact, even a Sequence 4 using the Nightmare ability could not forcibly drag George into a dream. You can die now. George flashed to Kalingus's sight and slapped him down. Kalingus instantly felt the shadow of death envelop him like a canopy in the sky. He wanted to dodge, but his body couldn't react in time. He wanted to use other abilities to fight back, but the thought had barely formed when he was already crashing to the ground like a meteor, losing all consciousness. This glove is quite interesting. After putting away Kalingus's extraordinary characteristics as a wind favorite after his death, he examined the sealed artifact called Crawling Hunger and a look of interest appeared on his face. The value of this glove to him was not in combat, but in the Faceless Man extraordinary characteristics it contained, which could allow him to advance directly. At the same time, the characteristics of other sequences within could also be used as research materials. And most importantly, With his crawling hunger, he could attribute any converted magic to the souls that crawling hunger had herded. For example, if he used light magic, he could say that he had herded the souls of the sun sequence. If he used wind, lightning, and water magic, he could say that he had herded the souls of the sailor sequence. In any case, he could always find a source. Otherwise, it would be hard to explain why a diviner like him could suddenly unleash a massive lightning bolt. If you are listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means it was downloaded and re-uploaded without effort. We warmly invite you to visit our channel, Fanfic World. There you will find the original version of this story and many other novels of various genres. We look forward to seeing you dive into a world of incredible novels. Chapter 749 Fame and Backlund. While George was studying the writhing hunger, Duke Negan and his entourage, having dealt with the chaos caused by Zaringus, rushed out of the mansion. However, when they saw George standing beside Zaringus's corpse, they froze. Zaringus was killed? Killed by this baby? Who is this baby, a parasite or a reincarnated being? Friend or foe? A series of thoughts raced through their minds. They dared not act rashly, but their faces showed wariness. At this moment, Duke Negan, the leader, suddenly revealed a strange expression. He tentatively asked George, "Are you the Barton's child?" He had glanced at their child while speaking with the Bartons and remembered his appearance. Now, this baby's appearance and clothes were exactly the same as the Barton's child who had been taken to the nursery by the maid. "It's me, so you should know I'm not an enemy," George nodded, not denying it. He could have left before Duke Negan and his men arrived, but he hadn't. It wasn't that he lacked strength and needed to develop stealthily, hiding behind the scenes. Since both churches knew about his situation, he felt there was no need to conceal anything from the kingdom's higher-ranking officials. He could cooperate with the churches, and naturally, he could cooperate with the kingdoms to obtain more useful resources and intelligence. I see. At this moment, Duke Negan's face suddenly showed a look of realization. No wonder Jack received special attention from the two archbishops. No wonder he couldn't find any special background in Jack no matter how hard he investigated. It turned out that the reason for all this was not Jack or Jack's parents and elders, but Jack's son who was less than a year old. He could easily kill Kalingus, who could unleash the strength of Sequence 5. This baby's strength was at least Sequence 4. Or even higher. Old acquaintances have arrived. At this moment, more than a dozen figures flew rapidly from a distance and landed in the mansion. The people who came were none other than the extraordinary individuals of the Church of the Storm Lord who had received the news and used their flying abilities to quickly come to the rescue. Leading them were Cardinal Ace Snake, a Sequence 4 Cardinal, and High Deacon Radar Valentine, whom he had met before. Among the men following behind the two was one he recognized. The man had deep blue hair, striking features, a rugged build, and bronze skin, the image of a tough guy weathered by years of wind and sun. He was none other than the Hanged Man, a member of the Tarot Society and the one who issued the mission to kill Zalingus. George remembered the Hanged Man's soul, so he recognized him instantly. Meanwhile, the Hanged Man, Alger Wilson, followed the bishop into Duke Negan's mansion. Seeing Zalingus lying lifeless on the ground, his expression immediately relaxed. He had originally been a slave on a small island overseas, but because of his elven blood, he was selected by the Church of Storms to join the choir. That's when he met Zalingus. However, because neither of them had any singing talent, they were sent to work as servants in a small chapel. The chapel's priest was a very cruel man, and the two suffered much abuse because of him. Later, they conspired to kill the priest by accident. This became the leverage Zalingus used to threaten him repeatedly after becoming a pirate. That's why he had to find a way to kill this guy, otherwise, if this was exposed, he wouldn't be able to stay in the Church of the Storm Lord, and would only be able to become a pirate. The other two had once discovered an island with abundant resources, containing a significant secret that could allow them to become high-sequence powerhouses. With Zalingus dead, only he knew this secret. "Good evening, Ace, Radar." George raised his hand to greet the bishop and senior deacon of the Church of the Storm Lord. Seeing George standing beside Zalingus's body, and after learning the general situation from Duke Negan, the two solemnly thanked George. "It's a good thing you were here, otherwise this guy would have really escaped. It's a small matter, we can use him to exchange for something with Crest." As George spoke, Crest and others from the Church of the Night Goddess also arrived at the scene. They couldn't fly and weren't as fast as the Church of the Storm Lord. "Congratulations, with the value of Zalingus, it's enough to exchange for a Sequence 5 potion for you," Crest nodded. Seeing that George was indeed acquainted with the bishops and high-ranking deacons of the two churches and was not an enemy, Duke Negan smiled and approached. To express my gratitude for this young gentleman's intervention, I'm willing to offer 10,000 gold pounds as a reward. This 10,000 gold pounds was a genuine offer, also a way to cultivate a closer relationship with this high-ranking powerhouse. Having a good relationship with such a powerful individual would be incredibly useful in the future. He killed Zelingus. Could he be power? Why is he an infant? Seeing George chatting happily with the bishops of the two churches and Duke Negan, and hearing their conversation, Alger was filled with suspicion. According to the notification from Mr. Fool, Justice discovered Zelingus's whereabouts at Duke Negan's ball, and Power stated that he happened to be at the ball. Therefore, the one who killed Zelingus should be Power. But Power is clearly an adult. How could he be an infant? Could it be that Power didn't intervene because he saw Zelingus had already been killed? Just as he was pondering this, he suddenly saw the infant wink at him and make a special gesture. He knows me. He recognizes me. He is Power. This was his first meeting with a baby, and the baby couldn't possibly recognize him, a low-ranking member of the church. Therefore, the baby must be Power, because recognizing him as the Hanged Man was why it made that gesture. Moreover, that special gesture was the one they devised at a previous tarot meeting to avoid accidentally harming their own people when finding Zelingus. When he was pulled away by Mr. Fool, he was in a spirit state, meaning Power's soul was actually that of an adult, while his body was that of an infant. Could Power be parasitizing an infant? Oh well, whether it is or not, at least the problem is solved. He hadn't expected Power to be so familiar with the bishops and high deacons of the two major churches. Alright, my parents are looking for me in the nursery. I need to go back now. George snapped his fingers, and a flame rose in the nursery. By the way, Your Grace, could you please instruct the servants in the nursery to keep this a secret? I don't want them to know about my situation yet. With that, he used the flame to leap back to the crib in the nursery. The maid, who had been anxiously searching for him, was so startled by his sudden appearance that she took several steps back. Just then, the Bartons walked in and breathed a sigh of relief when they saw that George in the crib was all right. They hadn't expected to encounter such a terrible thing while attending the Duke's ball. Thankfully, all three of them were unharmed. Chapter 750. Could it be him? Inside the main hall of Duke Negan's mansion, Audrey Hall, who was discussing the assassination attempt with her mother and the noble ladies, saw her father, sporting a handsome mustache, appear at the door. Making an excuse to leave, she approached him curiously and asked, "Daddy, how did it go?" "It's all taken care of, my child, don't worry," Earl Hall reassured Audrey, patting her head. Zelingus was intercepted and killed before he could escape the ducal mansion. Was it the church that came and dealt with it? Audrey feigned confusion, though she already had a guess. Earl Hall glanced subconsciously in the direction of the nursery, a strange expression on his face. Not a church, but a powerful figure. He's friends with the bishops and high deacons of the Church of the Storm Lord and the Church of the Dark Goddess. He happened to be attending the banquet and just helped out. He couldn't very well tell his daughter that it was an infant lying in the nursery who had done it. That's good, Audrey nodded, but began to analyze based on her observations. Judging from the current situation, the person who killed Zelingus should be Mr. Power. I didn't expect that Mr. Power had such good relations with the high-ranking officials of the two major churches. However, Father seems to find it hard to believe Mr. Power's identity, and he subconsciously glanced at the nursery. Is Mr. Power in the nursery now? But there are only the visiting guests' children and the maids in charge of greeting them in the nursery. Also, why haven't I seen anyone whose temperament matches Mr. Power's? Who exactly is Mr. Power? You will take half the credit for Zelingus's death. Duke Negan is planning to give you his resort estate in Dixie Bay. Audrey listened to her father's words, but her eyes were already observing everyone in the hall. As an observer, she was best at observing others and finding the information she wanted from the details. It was a rare opportunity to discover Mr. Power's true identity, and she didn't want to miss it. However, after her observation, she still didn't find anyone who matched Mr. Power's characteristics, but she did discover an interesting phenomenon. That's why Duke Negan and some high-ranking nobles and officials were even more enthusiastic towards the Bartons than before. Could that Jack Barton be Mr. Power? But his demeanor is completely different. Could it be him? When the banquet ended and the Bartons went into the nursery to bring out their child, Audrey was suddenly surprised to find that everyone, including her father, Duke Negan, and all the high-ranking nobles and officials who had just chased after them, were all staring at the baby in the Barton's arms. So even if she didn't believe it, rational analysis told her that the baby was the one who killed Zalingus, the one who is Mr. Power. To verify her guess, she pretended to casually walk past the Bartons and glanced at the baby they were holding. The baby, who had been sleeping with his eyes closed, seemed to sense her gaze and suddenly opened his eyes. Then the baby showed a mature smile that was completely out of character for his age, and made a special gesture with his little hand. It really is Mr. Power. Audrey's body stiffened. Although she had already guessed, she still found it hard to believe. She could only sigh inwardly. Just as Emperor Roselle said, the extraordinary world is full of wonders. Only after watching the Bartons disappear from her sight with Mr. Power in their arms did she come to her senses, and a question arose in her mind again. How did Mr. Power recognize her as Justice? But then she thought it made perfect sense. She, a mere Sequence 9 spectator, could deduce through observation and reasoning that the Barton's child was Mr. Power. It seemed plausible that Mr. Power, a powerful extraordinary being at least Sequence 5, could confirm her identity at the banquet. That night, after the frightened Bartons had fallen asleep, George opened his eyes and began tinkering with the sealed artifact he had acquired, wriggling hunger, so it's a soul imprisonment. After studying it carefully for a while, he gained a general understanding of the artifact's principle. It essentially imprisoned the souls of deceased extraordinary beings and forcibly extracted one of their abilities for use. Let's test the negative effects first. He didn't immediately release the Faceless One's soul to extract its extraordinary properties. Instead, he controlled the sealed artifact to unleash its nightmare ability, making his parents sleep even more soundly. After using it, he didn't go outside to find ordinary people's flesh and souls to feed it. He just waited there for the negative effects to take place. Without soul and flesh to nourish it, the writhing hunger suddenly became violent. In the blink of an eye, the glove transformed into gaping maw, lunging to devour George. However, when it bit into George, it found that it couldn't devour his flesh and soul no matter what it did. You've got some nerve. George raised an eyebrow, and a powerful soul pressure instantly surged towards the writhing hunger. The writhing hunger sensed the great being that was so far beyond its level, and its body immediately went limp, turning back into normal glove, no longer daring to act recklessly. If you don't obey, I'll erase your spirituality and then create a new one. George picked up the glove, threatening with a cold smile. The glove actually trembled in fear. This wasn't a threat. After a few days of research, he could actually convert the magic from the Harry Potter world that imbued objects with new spirit and intelligence. For him, sealed objects with spirit were easier to control than those without. If they disobeyed, he could forcibly erase their spirit and create a more obedient one. What negative effects? None. I need to convert a memory-type magic as soon as possible, George muttered to himself, commanding the writhing hunger to release the Faceless Man's soul and extract its extraordinary characteristics. If he could use Soul Search now, he could not only obtain an extraordinary characteristic but also see all of the Faceless Man's soul memories. I need some auxiliary materials. Go find Crest A. After obtaining the Faceless Man's characteristics, he didn't just crudely devour them, even though that would allow him to advance directly. He still wanted to experience the complete advancement process of taking a potion, so that he could understand the power system of this world more thoroughly. The Faceless Man's extraordinary characteristics could only replace the main ingredient. To make potions for advancement sequences, he needed some auxiliary materials. However, compared to the difficulty in obtaining the main ingredients, the auxiliary ingredients are much more readily available. Even ordinary people can collect them with a little time. But he was definitely too lazy to waste time collecting them, and it would be much easier to just go directly to Crustella. End of this chapter. Thank you so much for reading until the end. Don't forget to give it a like. Looking for more exclusive content and immediate access? Subscribe to our Patreon. Remember, every like, subscription or donation encourages us to continue. Thank you all. See you in the next video.